It was 3 a.m. on July 17, 2004 when I found myself outside the site of the seventh murder in 4 weeks. My partner Jim McAllister and I had been the first responders to this particular incident, the first two to survey the carnage before the forensics team and cleanup crew made it to the scene. We had followed a twisted breadcrumb trail of broken glass, debris and blood up to the master bedroom, where we found the mutilated body of the occupant, torn in half and adorned with tattered linen and ruby-tinged goose feathers. Her name was Sally McMahon. She was a 74-year-old woman who, according to her neighbors, lived alone and seldom had any visitors. There was no reason for anyone to have so much as let their dog run amok through her garden, let alone kill her. Yet here we were. We had ruled out the idea of it being an animal attack after the first victim's post-mortem. A local farmer who we found torn to pieces in his ransacked kitchen. Initially, we had put it down to being a bear or even a particularly aggressive wolf, but that was before a spook-sounding forensic pathologist from the local hospital called into Sheriff Averson's office to gravely relay to us that the bite marks found on the farmer's body were thoroughly baffling. Allegedly, the corpse was covered with human teeth marks, and more alarmingly, teeth marks that were deemed unrecognizable. We had all hoped that the following incidents when they happened wouldn't turn out the same way. That they were animal attacks, or that the post-mortem would yield different results. Of course, even by this seventh murder, some officers who were on the scene were still throwing around the idea that these were all just the work of one very aggravated bear. I had been standing outside the house, taking long, frequent drags on a cigarette and listening to the chatter of the other officers as the faulty streetlight above me played a fierce tug-of-war with the night. The detective assigned to the case, Donald Evans, emerged in the doorway and began to walk toward me, his face ashen, even in the mottled orange glow. "Officer Lemansky." Call me Mikhail," I said, extending my hand out to shake his. "You're Detective Evans, right?" "Yeah, that's me. It's my understanding that you were one of the first responders." "That's right," I said, my words muffled by the smoke that exited my mouth in a ghostly wisp. "I get that these incidents are uncommon around these parts, to say the least. But I need you to tell me if you or Officer McAllister noticed any details that stood out from the other crime scenes." I forced my mind to delve back into the last hour and a half. Jim and I had entered the house at around 3:10 a.m., firstly noticing an upturned cabinet and broken glass strewn at the bottom of the staircase. Upon reaching the landing, we found yet more ravaged furniture and broken glass, and more than that, a thick crimson trail of blood that led into the master bedroom. My mind drew a blank. It was gruesome, but nothing that really stands out from the off. The handprints. There were handprints on the ceiling. I said. "What?" Evans nearly choked. "There were bloody handprints on the walls and on floor. But there were some on the ceiling too." You sure they were handprints?" Evans stammered. "Sure as I am that we're having this conversation right now. Bloody handprints. Pronounced too. Wasn't like the perp threw the victim up there or anything like that. You can go and check for yourself." How did? Shit. Evans jogged back to the house and disappeared up the stairs. I looked over at Jim, who had been sitting on the hood of the car and staring into space ever since the forensics team had got here. The case was weighing on him, I could tell. With each passing incident, he grew quieter. His mind was on something, though. The handprints on the ceiling had thoroughly frightened and confused the hell out of me. All of the murders up until this point had been grisly, but none had really possessed any anomalous details, aside from the lack of fingerprints and the bizarre teeth marks, both of which we were all used to by now. I was about to attempt to make conversation with Jim when Evans rushed back out of the house. He looked even more somber than he had before, almost sickly. "You were right about the handprints. We're gonna take samples and see if we can identify the perpetrator from that." He almost sounded choked up. "Right. I didn't have much hope for that." No attempts at DNA fingerprinting or blood sampling had progressed the case at all in the last 3 weeks. The forensics team are saying that the corpse is covered in bite marks. Human? Probably. We'll have to wait for the post-mortem. Could still turn out different, we don't know yet. We knew all too well. Evans spoke with the same vain expectation that the other local officers did, and it was becoming apparent that there was no way to downplay this as something less serious than it was. There was a person out there doing this. Someone who was savagely butchering people, seemingly without reason. These were serial killings, yet the word serial killer had yet to be used by our sheriff or even Detective Evans. "You and McAllister can head home," Evans said, defeat lurking beneath his gruff, authoritative tone. "It's been a long night, and the forensics team will be here for a while." I wished Evans good luck in the hunt for any further evidence, and motioned to Jim to get in the car. I looked back at the house as I turned the vehicle at the end of the street, knowing that soon, the dawn would pull the obsidian shroud from the street, and the townspeople would awaken to yet more unanswered questions. A week later, my exhausted brain was jump-started one slow morning by a phone call whilst I was at my desk. I didn't recognize the number. Mikhail Lemansky. "Who am I speaking to?" "Hi, Mr. Lemansky. This is Alice Corman from the Jefferson Herald. I was wondering if you had any additional information on the ongoing investigation into the string of murders in Torkton." Her words were a shot of adrenaline that went straight to my head. Or perhaps any clarifying comments on today's story that could make it to a later publication. "How the hell do you know about this? How did you get this number?" I barked sternly. 3 days ago, we received detailed information about a series of killings in Torkton. "Do you read the newspaper at all, sir?" As if on cue, the most recent copy of the Jefferson Herald was slammed down in front of me by the exasperated Sheriff Averson. The bold headline perched arrogantly atop the cheap, fragile paper. "Terror in Torkton." The Sawney Bean murders. I looked up at Averson's scowl and then spoke into the phone. Excuse me for 1 minute." I ended the call immediately and set the phone down. I perused the article with growing disgust, already put off by the tasteless reference to the Scottish cannibal in the headline. In the early hours of July 17, Jefferson County Police were called to the scene of a suspected home invasion, only to be met with a grisly discovery. The mutilated, cannibalized body of Sally McMahon, 74. This is said to be the 7th in a string of similar horrific incidents that the authorities have been keeping quiet, as not to frighten the citizens of Torkton. Looking further down the page, I saw my last name appear, as well as Jim's. I looked up at Sheriff Averson in shock. "What the heck is all this?" I exclaimed. Averson's steely gaze persisted. "I was hoping you'd know," he said dryly. My mind raced. "I never told the press shit. I know that this is the kind of stuff that they love to sink their teeth into. Especially around here where nothing happens and..." A thought popped into my head. Jim. He had left his gun and badge on Averson's desk the day after the 7th killing, and no one had been able to contact him since then. I couldn't think of anyone else who would have tipped off the press about this whole ordeal, because no one else at the scene, no matter how harrowed, had been quite as out of their minds as Jim was. It seemed like the ever-irate sheriff had read my mind. "You think this was McAllister? Looks that way." The only other person who would have been liable to let any information escape the scene was the lady who called it in, and we made a point not to give her all the details after finding out about the bite marks. We spared those details from past witnesses, too. Well, no one in this freaking precinct has heard from him since last week's incident, and no one has been able to contact him. "Is he married, Lemansky?" the sheriff asked. "No. Kids. Girlfriend. He lives alone, Sheriff," I said, my voice descending into an unimpressed monotone. Yeah, Jim had just up and left. His personality had been melting away ever since the case was opened. It wasn't like him at all. But Averson was, and had always been, an uptight, neglectful son of a bitch. In the 8 years that I'd worked here, he'd never once made a real effort to get to know me or any of the other officers for that matter, despite the fact that he had very little else to do. Perhaps he had a chip on his shoulder because he was laid off from a big shot position in Seattle or something, but it's not like his dismissive cold self would ever tell me that story. I knew what was about to come out of his mouth. "Well, Lemansky, you know the dipshit better than anyone else here, so it falls on you to pull him out of wherever he's holed up and talk to him." "With all due respect, Sheriff," I said, almost gagging on my words. What would I even say to him? The papers have already printed. Averson cut me off. "You tell him whatever you gotta tell him. Have him head down to the Jefferson Herald and tell them that forensics screwed up and that it was an animal attack. I can't have these bastards making us look like we aren't handling this, so they're gonna pull that goddamn headline right now. This is a quiet town, and I don't want those heckin' Hoover boys down here. Cannibalism. Jesus Christ." Averson was perhaps the only human being in the world who still used the term Hoover Boys to describe the FBI after 1969. There was a joke about his ever so confidently spoken outdated lingo amidst the officers, unbeknownst to him. I shot up from my desk, unwilling to tolerate the unanswered what-ifs of the situation. "Sheriff, what if they don't pull the headline? What happens then? What if they don't retract their statements?" Averson, ever angry, stared at me with an expression that suggested that he was about to blow his top again. He shook his head as his mind attempted to come up with some kind of solution. "Right, we interview every single man. No, every single person above the age of 16 in Torkton. We get officers out there going door to door, demanding mandatory questioning for every man or woman, boy and girl above 16 years. They can tell anyone who refuses that they will be immediately put down as a suspect. I can't. I cannot have the local people think we aren't handling this. It was all to do with how we appeared, not what we were actually doing. Bastard. Sure, it mattered that the people of Torkton felt like we were confident and assured in the way we dealt with things, but the fact of the matter was, we weren't handling it at all. We were taking blind swings at an invisible assailant who had us all scared shitless. "Sheriff," I began. "Go find McAllister," he grumbled. I pondered arguing for a second, and then decided that there was no way I was winning this fight. All right. I'd tried contacting Jim earlier in the week to no avail, so I knew that my only real option was to head to his place. That is, if he hadn't packed all of his belongings together and jumped on the next plane to the East Coast. As Averson sauntered back to his office, I hurriedly tidied the small mess of papers on my desk and headed out to the lot, opting to take my own car instead of one of the precinct's vehicles. I felt a weight upon my shoulders, as though the thick humid air was pressing down on me. Jim's sudden absence was simply another rung on this ladder of stress. I was already thinking non-stop about what I had seen, and when I'd once again find myself staring at another grisly picture just like it. The rain clouds began to spit as I drove through the downtown area, their dark gray forms harbingers of an oncoming thunderstorm. Jim lived in an apartment complex about 4 miles away from the station, fairly close to the edge of town, and far enough away from the center for very few cares to be given about any renovations that it may have needed. I had only ever been there once to drop Jim off when his car was in for repairs, but it wasn't hard to find. The rain hammered down aggressively on the exterior of my car, the relentless metallic banging making me feel as though I was trapped inside a tin can at a shooting range. I pulled into the parking lot and grabbed an anorak that had slipped from the seat to the foothold in the back of the car, thinking of what exactly I would say to Jim. That was of course if he hadn't locked himself in his bathroom and, well, you know. That wasn't an idea that I was particularly fond of entertaining. I exited my car and walked briskly to the door of the apartment, dialing his room number into the panel by the door, and hitting call, as the rain lapped hungrily at my shoes. Jim, it's Mikhail. If you're in there, open up. I'm not here to drag you back to Averson. Just here to talk. Nothing came through the receiver. Looking across the lot, I saw Jim's car parked in the looming shadow of a pine tree. I tried calling again, this time trying to sound noticeably irritated. I know you're in there, man. It's been a shitty week for everyone who's on that case, but I've gotta talk to you. Besides, it's coming down out here and I'm cold as all hell. Open the damn door. The receiver crackled suddenly, and a hoarse voice spilled from the speaker. Mikhail? Jesus, come on up. I pulled the door open and wasted no time in bothering myself with the elevator. I dashed up the stairs to the second floor and marched down the corridor to his room. The door was open slightly, the deadbolt resting on the frame. I had barely even rapped on the door twice before Jim pulled it open, his eyes wide and a revolver in his right hand. For Christ's sake. I flinched and almost fell backwards at the sight of the weapon's maw staring me in the face. Jim lowered it and spoke through deep breaths and an apparent lump in his throat. I had to make sure it was you, Mike. You heard me on whatever. I said, perplexed by Jim's evidently rampant paranoia, but unwilling to make him feel any more uncomfortable than he already was. It's me, man. It's me. What the hell is this all about? I asked, gesturing at the weapon. You better come in. He said. I followed Jim into his dimly lit apartment. I had expected it to be far messier than it actually was. There were no takeout boxes littering the floor or sloppily stacked up on top of one another, and no offensive smells emanated from the kitchen. Jim had clearly been drinking, however. On his coffee table sat a quarter-full bottle of cognac, next to a cheap-looking whiskey glass. How long you been working on that? I said with a spiritless chuckle. Couple days, I guess. Strong stuff. You want any? His words swayed like a tree in the breeze. I'm good. Jim, I'm gonna be frank with you, I came here from the station. I saw the newspaper, and Averson needs you to get in touch with the Jefferson Herald and tell them to pull that head. Heck, Averson. Those were not words spoken by the liquid voice in his blood. They were assured, steady, and serious. Heck Averson and heck his callous bullshit. He's handled this about as well as a blind shrew in a knife fight. I wouldn't even dream of bringing what I found out to him because he'd have me in jail before I'd even got the whole story out. And believe you me, Mike, I found some stuff out. I found some goddamn stuff out. What did you find out? I asked, bewildered. You're gonna think I'm just a drunk idiot who snapped at the sight of too many spilled internal organs. But you're my closest damn friend here, and I trust you're gonna listen to me. I'm listening, I said. Firstly, yeah. I did give the Herald that information, and there is no way in hell I'm having them pull the story. No one is safe here, and they need to know what's going on, so they can take as many precautions as they can. The killer has no connections to any of the victims. Anyone could be the next casualty. Hold on. You think you know who the killer is? He gave me a steely, sincere look. My blood ran cold as disbelief flooded my veins. Jim was completely serious. Somewhere inside my head, logic and fantasy were locked in a fierce duel, and fantasy was winning. Jim, I said through nervous breaths. Do you know who the killer is? If you do, how the hell did you find out? I'm not a detective, Mike. Shit, I'm barely a police officer. But, I think I might actually have some idea. Go on. Jim poured himself another shallow glass of cognac. I used to frequent a bar downtown. The Foxhole, you know it. There was a retired old park ranger who would always be there on Friday nights, and he had a catalog of stories from his time, and we'd all sit around and listen to him. One night, I want to say about 6 months ago, he told a story that he said was his last call before he retired. It happened last year. Went like this. A hiking party of about 6 people got stranded in the deep woods in Mount Pilchuck State Park, wandered off the trail by accident, I guess. 2 of the 6 people came back. 2. A woman named Estelle Palmer and a man named Reuben Grundy. Grundy was in a hell of a state when the Rangers found them, allegedly said that he had no idea where the other 4 people had gone, that they had wandered off into the night. Here's where it gets even weirder. Palmer said that the night before they had been found, there were still 3 of them, another man I think. Palmer had been in and out of sleep, and swore that she saw Grundy follow the other guy into the woods when he was going to piss or something. The man never came back, but Grundy did 10 minutes later. She said he looked different. Thinner, taller, and insisted that he'd had blood all around his mouth. She'd felt this overwhelming fear and just pretended like she was asleep. Of course, her story was written off as delirious rambling. Jim cleared his throat and took another swig. Something about the story just kinda gave me a genuine feeling of dread that none of this guy's other stories had quite done. Then, the old bastard puts the cherry on top. A week later, the U.S. Forest Service finds remains in the woods with what were presumed to be human teeth marks on them, but they're so pulverized that they can't place exactly who they were. Grundy and Palmer are both interviewed again, but nothing comes of it. Palmer even tells the same story and says that she knows what she saw, but they write it off again. I told the old man before closing time that night that he'd scared the hell out of me, but that I didn't believe him, and he just looked at me with this deadpan expression and said, "Look it up, son." So, I did, and wad you know. It happened. Multiple different news sources covered the story. It freaking happened. Was barely covered on TV. Right. I started. But Pilchuck State Park is huge, the surrounding area is. Reuben Grundy lives in Torkton, Mike. He owns a ranch. He fumbled around with a mess of documents on the coffee table. Estelle Palmer used to live in Torkton too, literally a quarter-mile down the road from Grundy. She'd lived here her whole life, by the look of things. Are those police records? I asked. Jim gave me an irritated side eye and continued. Point is, after she came back from that expedition, she moved 4 towns away. packed up and left in about a week, sold the farmhouse she lived in to someone who'd been on her butt about buying it for years. Her childhood home, from what I read. Whether or not Reuben Grundy was responsible for those people disappearing, she saw something happen in those woods that made it so she couldn't even stand to be near him. Logic struggled onwards in its ongoing battle inside my brain. It strained and strained, but superstition's blade was far too sharp. Maybe she was a whack job. I said. You know what towny folks are like, live in the same place all their lives and clean bill of mental health. Jim exclaimed, waving a crumpled medical record in my face, clearly taken from a local clinic. No history of schizophrenia, depression, BPD or even so much as a panic attack. No prescribed medications. It's entirely possible that we could put what she saw down to hunger, dehydration or on the off chance, maybe even the delayed effects of a hallucinogenic trip. But the fact of the matter is, this woman up and left in a matter of days after that incident. It's not like Torkton's right next door to Mount Pilchuck, either. Jim dropped the medical record to the floor and shakily pulled up another document. He was excited, or terrified, or both. So, look here. Her new address is in May Creek. Jim, you're chazzing a rollercoaster of a story here. I said. If we take this to Averson, he's gonna give us a whole spiel about how we're idiots, and then take it upon himself to rehire me, just so he can fire me. We take it to Evans and he's gonna think we're on a wild goose chase, because he's a guy who deals with career criminals in Seattle and the odd home invasion. He's probably been with the force for what, 2-3 years? Face it, Mike. Our higher-ups are stuck scratching their heads, and we might actually have a lead. I know it sounds crazy, I know it's a long shot, and it's dumb luck that I heard that story, but we may have an actual suspect. In the moment, Jim's obsessive joining of the dots had rendered me dumbfounded, unable to think straight. So you're saying the killer is Reuben Grundy? Jim blurted out. Maybe I am just another drunk idiot who wishes he was a big shot detective, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but if there's even a chance that I'm right, we have to do something. Jim had a point, even in the midst of his fanatical behavior. Averson didn't care, and Evans, despite leading the charge, was being eaten up by his own fear. I saw it screaming behind his eyes the night of Sally McMahon's murder. Alright, what's the plan? I asked. We visit Estelle Palmer in May Creek, and we ask her about Grundy. Jim said through shaking breaths. What he was like, if he seemed different during or after the hiking trip, all that jazz. If we can convince her to help us beyond just talking to us, then maybe we actually have a chance at communicating it to Evans. Either that or she chases us out of her house with a double barrel for even asking. I said dryly. Ever the pessimist? Jim retorted. I laughed. Get some fresh clothes on, sober up, and let's get our asses to May Creek. Jim and I arrived at Estelle Palmer's residence in May Creek an hour later, having backtracked along numerous roads due to the exhausted GPS in my car. We parked across from Palmer's house. Number 5, Fairbank Street. The place was not at all what I had anticipated. I had expected us to pull up next to an overgrown lawn brimming with tall weeds, and a crudely arranged patio that led up to a dingy porch with a grimy screen door. Perhaps there would have been a sign hammered onto the wall made of plywood, and scrawled on it in red paint would have been the words, "Trespassers will be shot." It was nothing like that. If anything, it was not unlike any of the other idyllic-looking houses in May Creek. The lawn was a healthy burst of green, each blade of grass seemingly trimmed down to exactly the same size, and just by the curb lay a toy truck that must have belonged to a child. Jim swept his hair out of his eyes and opened the door of the car. Well, here goes. We either get our answers or we get a door slammed in our faces. We approached the door, peering through the living room window and catching sight of a woman sitting in a reclining chair, watching a young boy of no more than 3 years of age playing on the floor. She looked up as Jim rang the doorbell and stood up to exit the living room, motioning to the toddler to stay where he was. Estelle Palmer swung the door open, a sense of immediate irritation glinting in her eyes. She was about 38 years of age, with long dirty blonde hair that fell to her shoulders. Noticing her annoyance, I began to speak. "Mrs. Palmer." "Miss. I'm not married," Estelle said. "Right. Miss Palmer." Jim took over. "My name's Jim McAllister and this is Mikhail Lemansky. We don't mean to upset you, but we're cops," she snapped. Jim was visibly surprised. "I figured. Where you from?" "Sultan." "Don't tell me you're from Seattle." "Torkton," I said. Her glare narrowed even further. "It's our understanding that you used to live there." "Yes. What's it to you?" She seemed even more defensive now. "We came to inquire about." Jim struggled over unnecessary eloquence, even though he fully expected to receive the cold shoulder. Miss Palmer's irritation reached its peak, and she began to shut the door. "It's about Reuben Grundy," Jim finally managed. She stopped and peered through the crack between the frame and the door. Her annoyance had dissipated, and worry flooded her eyes. "You can come in," she finally said, ushering us inside. The interior of the house was as picturesque as the exterior, the staircase adorned with paintings of famous North American mountains, the kitchen clean and well organized. Estelle led us into the living room, where the boy, who I presumed to be her son, looked up at us with that wide-eyed, curious expression that is so common in young children. "Baby, go play in your room, okay?" Estelle said to the boy. He looked down at the plastic dinosaur he was playing with, then back at his mother, before picking up the toy and sauntering down to the end of the hallway. Before Jim or I could get a word out about her sweeter kid her worrisome expression returned. "I haven't seen Reuben in over a year," she said. "When I moved here he used to call my cell 5 times a week before I changed numbers. Didn't tell him I was moving here, of course I didn't. What the hell's he done?" "It's not what he's done," I said. "It's what we think he might have done." "Miss Palmer." Jim started. "Please, it's just Estelle," she said softly, seeming far less vexed by our presence than she had been minutes before. "Estelle," Jim said. "The situation is this. My friend and I have reason to believe that Reuben Grundy may be linked to a series of violent serial killings in Torkton. However, it's little more than a hunch, and the police investigation has been a complete mess from the outset, so we need your help. It's my understanding that you knew Reuben for most of your life." Estelle sat down in the reclining chair, motioning for us to sit down on the couch. "My whole life, yeah. His old man, Scott, owned this ranch down the road from my old house, and he inherited the whole place when Scott passed. We were in the same grade at school. He was always a smart worldly guy, knew a whole lot about nature, and cared a lot for the animals he reared on the ranch. Could name every damn plant in the woods." She chuckled as she reminisced. "Throughout your childhood, did he ever seem off to you at any point?" I asked. "No, never. Not once did I have him pinned as the outcast or the weirdo kid. Everyone in high school loved Reuben." I have to ask about the hiking trip. Jim said. 4 people disappeared and you and Ruben were the only ones who came back. You moved away a week after. What the hell happened? Estelle's voice quaked as she spoke, fear mingling with the worry in her eyes. Ruben. She trailed off, straining against the painful memories to force the words out. Ruben changed on that trip. We were a week into it and there was clearly something strange going on with him. Usually he'd been musing about conifer trees and mountain lions, but he barely spoke, and when he did, the way he talked was fragmented and hoarse, like he'd forgotten his own native language. He seemed irritated when we tried to talk to him. He didn't talk about much, but when he did, he said. Her words crumpled to the floor again. I leaned forward. What did he say, Estelle? He said he was hungry. An electric current surged down my spine. The silence rang in my ears like the whining aftermath of an explosion. I'd hear him at night. He'd sit out by the fire longer than anyone and mutter to himself, saying things like, God, I'm so freaking hungry, in this voice that I'd never heard come out of him before. When it became obvious that we were lost, that's when people started disappearing. First Becca, then Miguel, then Ruth, and then Nick, the night before we were found. When Nick disappeared, I saw Ruben follow him into the forest. I didn't hear anything, but Ruben came back later without him. He looked different. Sickly, pale, skinny, taller somehow. And I swear to God he was covered in blood. I looked over at Jim, who was staring intently at her. Jesus Christ, you drunk bastard. You brilliant drunk bastard. You might actually be onto something. Maybe I was delirious, maybe I was. He looked the same as ever the next day, when the park rangers found us. I just couldn't shake this feeling that I was still in danger, though. He talked in that cracked, hoarse way still. The police paid it no mind, wrote it off as the effects of dehydration, and wrote my story off as a mirage. I moved as soon as I could when I got home. Stayed with my mom in Olympia for a short while before I found a place here in May Creek. Like I said, maybe I was crazy. I'm not saying Ruben Grundy definitely killed those people, but I am certain that something in those woods got inside of him and made itself a home. And I don't think it ever left. Jim's intense concentration turned to slight confusion. What do you mean something? Estelle gave a half smile, as though she were embarrassed. I'm not one to believe in folk tales, Mr. McAllister. Never have been, even when my old man tried to scare me to death with them when I wasn't much older than my son. But Ruben was always the same up until that trip, and he changed so suddenly. Call it what you want. A spirit, a sickness, the call of nature, whatever. Something took a hold of Ruben. Took him away. I'm not saying that if you investigate him you'll definitely find the answers you're looking for. But you might want to try. Noticing that Estelle was on the verge of tears, I grabbed Jim's arm and said, "Thank you so much for your help. We should probably get going and leave you in peace." Estelle, Jim said tentatively. "I don't suppose we could convince you to come with us." "No," she interjected. "I can't see Ruben ever again, not after what I saw in those woods. He doesn't know where I live, but I still lock every door and window at night, still watch the footage from the security camera every morning. Sometimes I think if I met him again it would lay some ghosts to rest, but something tells me those ghosts are real damn stubborn. I can't put myself in danger. I'm the only thing that Robert has." She motioned down the hall toward her son's bedroom. Jim looked as though he were about to persist in his argument, but he simmered down quickly. "Thank you for your time, Estelle, sincerely," Jim said as we stood up and walked to the door. We're gonna go give Ruben a visit. And we will find out who's doing this, I promise. Thank you. Estelle replied. Good luck. She silently watched us walk down the driveway to the car, a solemn look in her eyes. Perhaps she was reliving all those memories, or perhaps she thought she had just sent us further into something we would regret being a part of. I looked over at the house one last time as I started the car. Through the living room window, I could make out a blurred picture of Estelle cradling her son in a tender embrace. We drove. I pulled the car up to Torkton Police Station at 6:15 p.m., having convinced a particularly irate Jim to stop off there first. I told him to wait in the car while I briefly went to talk to Averson. Apparently, he'd at the very least done a good job of rounding up the local populace for questioning, as I had to sift through a chattering crowd of townsfolk who were gathered outside and inside the station. I ran to Averson's office, rapping sharply on the door. Who the hell is it? Came a gritty, aggravated yell. I opened the door, and my gaze met Sheriff Averson's cockeyed stare. Where the heck have you been, Lemansky? Have you interviewed a man named Ruben Grundy? I asked, ignoring him. Who? Averson said. Ruben Grundy. Rancher from the north end of Torkton. Heck should I know? Averson said, taking an aggressive swig of his coffee. Officer Barnett has a checklist. Go ask her. Now where in God's name have you been? You get McAllister to pull that article. I slammed his door and ran to the front desk, where I found Officer Barnett busying herself with an Excel spreadsheet. I nearly collided with the desk, startling her. Eve, I said, letting out a long-held breath. Have you interviewed a man named Ruben Grundy yet? Visibly confused by my urgency, she pulled up the records and perused them for about 10 seconds. Looks like we had him in a couple hours ago. We cleared him, he's not down as a suspect. Christ. Where's Detective Evans? Monroe. She said absent-mindedly. Something came up from another case, and he left a few hours. How long did you have Grundy in the interview room for? My words were ablaze with insistence. 5 minutes, in and out. Barnett replied. You've gotta be freaking kidding me. They didn't even ask him about the hiking trip. Thanks. I dashed out of the station, feeling the mystified eyes of the townspeople boring into me. Jim was waiting in anticipation, craning his neck around as I ran toward the car. I threw the door open and clambered inside. They cleared the bastard 2 hours ago. Evans is in Monroe. We're heading to Grundy's place. Let's go, Jim said. His tone was crawling with nerves. He had clearly expected it to come to this, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Fear brewed underneath my adrenaline rush. The sun began to exhaustedly sink below the distant mountain as we sped through Torkton, painting a crimson outline on the remaining clouds. The stench of dread began to creep in through the cracked passenger side window with every inch that the sun receded. I began to wish it would take longer to get to Grundy's ranch. Anything to stave off the terrible gut feeling. So, Evans went to Monroe. What for? Jim asked, obviously desperate to break the silence. Barnett said it was another case. Whether or not that's a lie, I don't know and I don't care. He's shit scared and he's not here, which makes him useless. I replied. What about Averson? He wasn't even doing so much as ushering the interviewees in. Just asked me about whether or not the Herald had been convinced to pull the front page. We're on our own, Jim. As I said that, the row of buildings on North Avenue disappeared and Grundy's ranch came into view, sitting less than a quarter of a mile down the road from where we were. I could see a modest-looking, well-kept one-story house that sat at the head of a sprawling perhaps 3 acres of land that I assumed all belonged to Grundy, as all throughout the grassland were grazing cattle, and out behind the house stood a barn, towering proudly over the tiny abode in all of its rustic glory. Doing our utmost to compose ourselves, Jim and I parked the car at the end of the gravel driveway, preparing for what would hopefully be our final visit of the day. We walked up to the front of the house, trepidation hanging like a meat hook on the otherwise calming summer breeze. I knocked on the screen door and squinted through the glass. From the end of the hallway emerged a man, standing about 6'4". He made a slow jog toward the screen door and pulled it open enthusiastically. He was as tan as one might expect a rancher to be, dressed in tattered jeans and a polo shirt, and looked to be in his late 30s. He had thinning brown hair that stuck out in tufts from underneath an ill-fitting baseball cap, and a subtly auburn-colored beard. He gave a smile, his eyes glinting a little. "Can I help you boys?" he asked, his voice a chipper, gravelly song. I was thrown off for a second. I had expected a weathered, malnourished-looking man covering his face with a wide-brimmed hat. I had expected an inhuman rasp. I had expected him to tell us to leave him alone. Jim jumped in. "My name's off. Detective Cal Mariano, and this is Detective Dave Crowley. We're here regarding the town-wide questioning of the residents of Torkton." Grundy chuckled nervously, his brow wrinkling. "Oh, right. There must have been some mistake. The police already interviewed me a few hours ago." "We understand, sir, and we're very sorry to trouble you," I said, joining Jim and playing the role of Detective Crowley. "See," Jim said. "It's a big operation, and the Torkton Police Department are swamped, as you might imagine. Unfortunately, they missed a couple of vital questions when interviewing a few people, and they've sent us round to get extra details." "Oh right, of course," Grundy said, his expression softening a little. "By all means, come on inside." Jim and I stepped into the hallway as Grundy closed the door. Inside, the temperature was cool, yet an unpleasant smell sat in the air. I heard the door lock behind us. Had the door been locked before? I couldn't remember. "Hope you boys'll forgive me for the smell." He laughed. "Got a rat infestation at the moment, and the bastards keep dying in the walls and underneath the floorboards. I try to keep the stench away as best I can till I can dig them out." "Right on, man," I said, humoring his conversation. "Had a problem with rats myself about a month ago." Grundy led us to his kitchen, which seemed to be the biggest and most impressive room in the otherwise small house, with a large granite counter spanning its entire length, and a state-of-the-art cooker sitting in the middle. On the counter was a hefty pile of raw meat. "Christ," I remarked. "That all from your cattle?" "Yes, sir," Grundy exclaimed with pride. "All locally sourced to this very ranch. The butcher shops downtown love this stuff." "I'll bet," I said. "Now, Mr. Grundy, you mind if Detective Mariano and I ask you some questions?" "Shouldn't take long." "Sure. Have a seat," Grundy said, gesturing to the kitchen table. He leaned against the counter, turning his attention to the pile of meat. He still hadn't asked to see our badges. "I'm listening, boys. Fire away." "Torkton Station clocks your interview at about 5 minutes, correct?" I asked. "Yeah, real quick in and out. Think they wrote me off because, well, I don't have a record and I mean, look at this place. I'm busy all the time, ain't got kids to help me around the ranch," Grundy replied. "Of course, as far as criminal charges go, your record's completely clean, Mr. Grundy. Jim said. MHM. Grundy picked up a meat cleaver and began hacking at the steak. The instrument came down with a resounding thwack, separating a piece of the animal's flesh from the rest of the flank. I suppose we're here to ask about the hiking trip you took in April of 2003, with a party of 5 other people. I said. Grundy exhaled loudly as though he were sighing, however he didn't turn around or stop what he was doing. The cleaver came down again. Louder this time. Oh, of course. I was a little surprised myself that they didn't ask. Well, let's start with a general question. I began. What happened? What's your story? Got lost on the 6th day of the trip. We'd intended it to be a long trip anyhow, but we ended up having a hell of a time finding the foot of Mount Pilchuck, and found ourselves lost in the woods with no idea which direction we were supposed to go. Becca disappeared on the first night that we got lost. He paused, falling into a reminiscent chasm for just a moment. And did you know Becca well? Jim asked. Known her since high school. We were gonna get married this year. There was a pain in his voice. This isn't our guy. Shit. This isn't our guy. I'm sorry. I said. That must have been diff. I was cut off by the startling sound of the cleaver making contact with the cutting board, slicing cleanly through another piece of meat. Much louder than before. Yeah. I try not to think about it. It got hazy after that, real hazy. There was this pain. It sounded like he was struggling through his sentences now. Pain? I asked. Started in my head. Clouded my vision. How long did the pain go on for? Jim asked. The electric current I had felt in Estelle's living room sprung to life again. It was like a blade this time, grazing my spine with serrated teeth. I thought I had become accustomed to the stink of the dead rodents, but I knew what that smelled like. This was something different. Something that carried a far more bitter scent. Hope you boys'll forgive me for the smell. 2 days. Spread to my hands and feet. Felt numb after that. And then. I guess I felt good. Grundy said, his voice assuming a strange grating quality. He brought the cleaver down again, the abrasive thud accompanied by the wet sound of tearing meat. Grundy turned around to look at us. He seemed paler than he had before, his posture slightly crooked. The glint in his eyes was gone. What do you remember about the disappearance of Nick Lee, the night before you were rescued? I inquired. He paused, setting the cleaver down. Had I blacked out? His cheekbones now seemed sunken. His eyes were even darker. His fingers were freakishly long and thin. An eerie silence waltzed with the tension that had clouded the kitchen. It was just animals, at first. His voice was a sickly rasp. What? When I came back from the trip. It was just animals. Coyotes, mountain lions, prairie dogs. None of my own cattle. What the hell are you talking about? My mouth was dry. The stinging scent of decomposition couldn't be ignored. It was just animals until the feeling came back. There was something in those woods, boys. Something that called to me. Something that wouldn't let me die. Something that told me. Grundy's voice was no longer a rasp. It sounded like a ghostly moan, as though his voice were wrapped up in a violent gale. His eyes were cold black pits. His teeth were unnaturally long, forming yellow daggers in his mouth and forcing his face into a mocking grin. Jim stood up, backing away. Told you what, Mr. Grundy? Something that told me to eat. Grundy finally said. Despite his unnatural tone, his voice was somehow cold, matter of fact. I killed the people on that hiking trip. I knew all of them, and I killed them and ate their flesh. Grundy said. Oh my God. Oh my freaking God. Estelle was right. There was no logical resolution to what had seemed like a crazy hunch. We were two idiots, in over our heads. Why? WH. Jim could hardly speak. I tried eating animals and raw meat until that feeling came back. He began circling the table. That's when I began breaking into houses. People I didn't know, people I did know, some I liked, some I didn't care for. I tore them all apart. I stood up and stumbled away next to Jim as Reuben Grundy stalked toward us, his sharp canines protruding. Why are you telling us this? Because. His icy tone slowly began to thaw. They can do what they like with me now. They can fry me, they can commit me as another criminally insane nut, because they think they can control me like every other guy that went out and killed young girls, because mommy was too rough on them. It helps them sleep at night to know that those sick bastards are all just human beings that they can control, one way or another. But this rage inside me, this power. A thick rope of drool fell from his mouth and pooled on the floor. There are things darker than man in this world, boys. In the soil, in the mountains, in the trees, in some dark corner of a big city. It might make you feel better to believe that other people are the cruelest thing this life has to offer, but I'm afraid that just isn't true. Grundy's mouth was unnaturally wide, the bed of spikes inside no longer resembling anything remotely human. A small glimmer sat in the center of his black eyes, like a tiny brilliant star inside a black hole. Hunger. Jim and I dived in opposite directions as Grundy lunged at both of us, an animalistic howl erupting from his throat. I heard a chair collide with the counter as I scrambled to my feet, coming face to face with the creature that had been or still was Reuben Grundy. Any disbelief I had could not be justified. This nightmarish picture was here in front of me, and it was very, very real. Just as his maw opened again and another monstrous groan emitted from within him, a gunshot rang out, and Grundy doubled over in pain, screeching with the ferocity of 1,000 banshees. Jim stood behind him, his pistol drawn. Grundy twitched violently, the motion producing a sickening crunch, as though one of his bones had broken. Without a moment's hesitation, Grundy jumped from the floor to the ceiling and took off down the hallway to what I had assumed to be the staircase to the basement, skittering like an insect. His harrowing howl echoed through the house like another angry gust of wind. Drawing my own weapon, Jim and I gave chase. The door to the basement hung wide open, and any vaguely pleasant smells in the house were now being eaten alive by the very clear aura of death. This wasn't the smell of a rat problem, that was for sure. For about 10 seconds, the house resounded with clattering and screaming coming up from the basement, and as soon as it had begun, it suddenly ceased. Dead silence. I exchanged a terrified glance with Jim. I wish I was still drunk. Jim grumbled shakily. We cautiously crept down the stairs to the basement, the light dwindling more and more with each step. My hands were gripping the pistol so hard that my knuckles had turned white, and an oasis of sweat had sprung from my palms. Jim fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a flashlight, turning it on and allowing the beam to illuminate the pitch blackness. The beam pierced the void that sat in the doorway, creating a tunnel of light that led our eyes to a sight that confirmed what I had feared the moment that smell had hit me. The floor of the basement was piled with remains of all kinds. Animal, human, arms, legs, insides. Some had clearly been dragged down here no more than a few days ago, and some were weeks, maybe even months old, left on the ground to decay, and denied a real burial. A shuffling sound from off to the left grabbed our attention, and Grundy stepped back into view, his metamorphosis having advanced even further. He stood well over 7 feet tall, his rib cage protruding, as though his skin were vacuum packed around it. His face was now ghoulishly inhuman, his eyes like hollow pits and his teeth like battle-scarred tusks. Reuben Grundy perched like a gargoyle atop his morbid spoils. A king of the dead in his hall of treasures. He spoke, a baritone growl sitting underneath his strangled voice. "Sorry. The refrigerator down here is broken." A sick smile spread across his face, and it was enough to tip Jim and I over the edge. We just started shooting, and we kept on shooting until both of our weapons had completely run out of bullets. When our eyes were no longer obscured by the obnoxious muzzle flashes, the flashlight fell on what was seemingly the lifeless corpse of the beast that Reuben Grundy had turned into. We were both shocked. Having expected him to attempt to flee the basement or at least jump out of the way. The twisted monster now lay still among his quarries. The entire Torkton Police Department arrived half an hour later, and the deeply panicked, white-faced Detective Evans arrived another half hour after that. The whole cleanup operation took the best part of an entire week, but that first night was a harrowing ordeal, even for those who didn't have to scrape up the remains or lay eyes on the creature that was responsible. If it had been any other case, I would have relished the look of horror on Sheriff Averson's face when he knew quite how badly he had handled everything, and the realization that he would have to deal with those heckin' Hoover boys when a black SUV pulled up outside the crime scene. The expression on his face was one shared by everyone who had to wrap their heads around the fact that the near 8-foot-tall monster that was dragged out of that basement had been, at one point, Reuben Grundy. I was glad that the case had been closed, but I felt very little in the way of catharsis. Jim and I had come face to face with the unknown, and the unknown had filled our heads with something unforgettable. There are things darker than man out there. Things we can't control the way we can control the Dahmers and John Wayne Gacy's of the world. We may have put an end to Reuben Grundy's otherwise never-ending hunger, but whatever was inside him is still tearing its way through the forests and the mountains, searching for another viable host to infect with the burning rage it carries with it. I'm not so sure that we can always fight what we don't understand. Part I. The Snow Fort. Christmas was always a whimsical time for young Christopher. For as long as he could remember, Santa Claus came down the chimney, left gifts, ate cookies, drank cocoa, and fed his reindeer. Then, he was gone without a trace left behind, with the exception of maybe some crumbs and some hoof prints. The time of year was mystical to Christopher, and he loved it so. Just like any other child, Christopher was also obsessive when it came to catching Santa in the act. Oh, how he would boast to his friends when he finally captured a photo of Santa climbing out of his fireplace, or film of flying reindeer. He yearned for the opportunity, and this year, his desire was particularly singular. You see, Christopher had an ingenious plan. There was no chance of it failing. His attempts in earlier years, 4 to be exact, had taught him what simply would not do. There would be no trying to stay awake, listening for sleigh bells, or setting up a video camera in front of the fireplace. No, Mr. Claus was just too clever for that. This year, Christopher would hide outside, in the snow. After his parents went to sleep, he would take his father's thermos, with his own hot cocoa, and hide in the snow fort he and his brother built in the yard. That would be the last thing Santa expected. As for staying awake, he was sure he could do it. After all, he was 9 now, and he knew how hard it was to sleep on Christmas Eve, anyway. But he didn't want to take any chances. So, he would take some fishing line from the garage and tie it to the fireplace door handle, then unwind it all the way to the snow fort. That way, if he somehow fell asleep, the string would tug on him when Santa opened the fireplace door. When Santa finally appeared, he would get everything recorded on his older brother's cell phone. Voila. With bedtime on Christmas Eve, Christopher went to his room to feign sleep until his parents had gone to bed. He lay there for what seemed time without end, until finally he heard the master bedroom door creak shut at the end of the hall. He lay there another half hour or so, ensuring all was quiet, and then crept out from under his quilts. He dressed, took the thermos and fishing line that he had pilfered before, and slunk down the stairs, careful to avoid the dreaded creak in the third step from the top. The front door was the final test, getting it open and closed behind him without making too much of a racket. Starting to sweat a bit in his coveralls, he held his breath until he had closed the door behind him, and no lights had come on upstairs. He walked backward to the fort, unwinding the fishing line, and then finally breathed deeply when he sat down inside. At last. Christopher sat waiting for about an hour before he felt the sleepiness creeping in. He fought it, but he ultimately lost. He leaned over and went to sleep in the snow, depending on his fishing line to wake him. 2 hours later, around 2 in the morning, Christopher felt a tug. At first, his brain translated it to some fuzzy sensation deep in dreamland, but eventually his subconscious jolted him with real life. He bolted upright, fumbling for the cell phone, heart pounding. He slowly poked his head around the door of the snow fort. 2 people, dressed in black, stood at Christopher's front door. He froze, unable to think, but somehow knowing that these 2 were up to no good. Fright overwhelmed him, he wet himself, and he fainted, face down in the snow. He awoke a few minutes later to the sound of his mother's screams. Part 2, Fractals. Chris, not Christopher since his parents' murder, had not spoken to his brother, Jonathan, in almost a year. 2 decades had passed since that Christmas, and no matter how hard Chris tried, the 2 just could not get along for more than a few days at a time. Jonathan had awoken in the middle of the night that Christmas to get a snack downstairs, and on his way down the hall, noticed that Chris was out of bed. He made his way downstairs, expecting to see his brother on the couch, endeavoring to catch Saint Nick as he always had. That was when the front door creaked open, and 2 dark-clad men sidled through the front door. He ran as fast as he could back up the stairs to his cell phone to call 911, only to find it missing. Naturally, Jonathan blamed Chris for everything after that. The 2 men had come upstairs while Jonathan hid under some clothes in his closet hamper. He heard his mother's screams and was too scared to come out. He heard the men leave with jewelry, etc., and went to check his parents. He would not re-visualize that scene. He staggered downstairs and found Chris in the kitchen, a blank look on his face and smelling like urine. Jonathan snatched the phone from him and dialed 911. Years of therapy and foster homes later, Jonathan had not found it in his heart to forgive Chris. It was his fault that Jonathan could not call for help. His fault that the front door was unlocked. Jonathan couldn't be in Chris's presence very long without reminding him. Recently, Chris and Jonathan had agreed to meet for lunch. Jonathan was wary of the meeting, but his wife, Molly, insisted that he had an obligation. Chris was family. So there they sat, in a greasy spoon diner eating fried food that would surely shorten their lives in some capacity. In the way that awkward small talk does, the brothers found themselves talking about vacations. The wife and I want to get away this weekend, as a matter of fact, but we can't find a babysitter. We can go another time. Jonathan said. I could watch the kids for the weekend, I'm home. Haven't seen them in a while anyway. Chris offered, over-eagerly trying to buy some sort of approval, as always. Jonathan didn't stop to think about what he said next. I wouldn't be comfortable with that, he stated, abruptly. Chris looked Jonathan in the face, anguish filling his eyes with glassy hurt. He wiped his mouth, stood, left $20 on the table, and exited the diner. That was how they had left it. Jonathan making a snippy remark and Chris solemnly walking out of an already shaky lunch meeting. Chris had looked at him like a puppy at a rolled newspaper. Jonathan hadn't been able to face him again since. Meanwhile, Chris tried to move on with his remedial life. Oh, how he'd hated watching his mother and father being lowered into the cold ground on a gray, snowy day in January. His brother would not look him in the eye. The lady from CPS that smelled like hairspray and cigarettes wouldn't even hold his hand. What was going to happen to him? Would he and his brother be separated? How come Santa had never appeared? He was partially to blame for being late. He had fallen asleep in the snow and woken up without parents. Now back from the awkward lunch, as he sat in his cubicle at his dead-end job for kids without parents that grew up to be adults without parents, he pondered the last 20 years of his life. He punched numbers and symbols into a monotonous spreadsheet for Sentinel Home Security, as he spiraled down into his regret and resentment, traipsing a snowflake of repeating fault, despair, and longing. Christopher was robbed of experiencing joy at Christmas time ever again. His brother hated him, and for what? Because a jolly fat man had disappointed him year after year. He could not be trusted. To make matters worse, everyone thought it was his fault. They had even tried to tell him Santa was a fake, that he did not exist. They insisted, but that simply could not be true. If it was, Christopher had deprived his parents the chance to live. No, Santa was no saint. Just a man that perpetually lets people down. After the murders, Santa stopped visiting Christopher. Home after home, never again did he receive anything he put on his list. Eventually, he quit making them. He added Santa to another list, a list of people that had abandoned him. He despised the phonetic parallel between his name and Kris Kringle. Eventually, Chris figured out that mentioning disdain for Santa earned him quizzical looks from, well, everyone. He learned that most thought of Santa as a myth for children, incapable of causing any harm. But how they were wrong. Santa Claus had caused the death of his parents. He was an arcane, evil man. Day after day, Chris sat in his ringlet of blame and desperation for people to understand. More than anything, he wanted Jonathan to comprehend, to forgive him for a crime he had never really committed. As he trudged home one November evening in the curbside slush, he passed what may have been the last window shop on Earth. In it, a 4K television played How the Grinch Stole Christmas in all of its Ueshian majesty. The idea practically slapped him in the face, with all of the grandiosity that the season could muster. Part 3, Making Christmas. So simple it was, the notion of imitating Santa Claus, yet so brilliant. Chris would have no problem emulating the man. No, not emulating, but embellishing. A suit was easy to come by, and if he started out small, it would be rather inexpensive. Money wasn't even really an issue, since Chris hadn't spent much except for necessities. Grandiose, but, oh, the joy he would bring. Children and adults everywhere would be convinced of what Chris already knew. What's more, he could start with Jonathan's children. This would inevitably kill two birds with one stone, as long as Chris could keep his own secret. He would simply sneak in on Christmas Eve, leave gifts, and Jonathan would be forced into believing that Santa had left them. This would prove Chris's claim that their parents' death was caused by Santa, because he was real. It was infallible. All that was left was to find a suit and decide what Michael and Samantha wanted. The latter would require a bit of reconnaissance. So, for 2 weeks Chris used his lunch break to drive his dying but not yet dead Impala past Jonathan's house. Each time, he would check his surroundings for onlookers, and then quickly open the mailbox to search it for Samantha and Michael's letters to Santa. Each time, he would be disappointed. Chris had almost given up when, finally, he opened the box to find a white envelope, addressed in a child's handwriting to the North Pole, with a Clemation Rudolph stamp on the wrong side. He quickly pilfered it and returned to his apartment, brimming with pride for his master plan. The contents of the letter broke Chris's heart, but reaffirmed the need for his mission. Dear Santa, my dad would be so mad if he found this letter. He says you aren't real and that you're just a way for adults to not accept responsibility. But I believe in you. I am only 5 years old, but I know something happened to Dad when he was little. So for this Christmas I just want something to prove you're real. Anything will be fine, I just want him to feel better. Love, Michael. Chris's eyes brimmed with tears, and he knew that he had to do this thing for the kids, as well as Jonathan. He had to do something to assuage the pain Santa was causing this family. Part IV. There's a light on this tree. At last, Christmas Eve had arrived. Chris laid the suit out on his bed, along with the gifts he would leave Samantha and Michael, an easy bake oven and a creepy crawlers kit, both purchased at a vintage toy convention with cash. Chris thought the vintage nature of the toys were a nice touch. Who else but Santa could acquire such things? He also knew he needed the anonymity of cash. No one would ever be able to prove it was him. Yes, he would put the fat man to shame. A few hours from now, the kids would wake up and exclaim their excitement, while his brother accepted that Chris was expunged of any blame. Around midnight, Chris put on the suit and loaded the packages into his car. He drove the 10 minutes to Jonathan's neighborhood and parked 100 yards down the street, avoiding the risk of his car being seen and recognized. He gathered the kids' packages and walked briskly down the street, careful to avoid the halo of the one street light in his path. He approached Jonathan's house from the side yard, avoiding the eyes of any night owl neighbors who may still be up. He peeked through the side window and found himself gazing into the dining room, through which he could see the living area, devoid of any children staying up to catch the man that Chris now considered a charlatan. Yes, now Chris was the real deal. Santa would soon find himself obsolete. Then came the most critical moment of the entire operation, gaining entry. Once again, Chris had planned well, and also benefited from his obvious destiny. Having worked for the security company, he had sold Jonathan his security system at a steep discount in a previous attempt to buy reconciliation. It hadn't worked, but it had provided Chris with the knowledge that to save money, the back windows had not been wired into the system. After assuring that no one remained awake in the house, Chris slunk around to the back and started popping off screens and testing window locks. He was beginning to get nervous that he would have to break one when the second to last slid open. And he blames me for leaving the door unlocked. Chris mumbled quietly. The rest was easy. He closed the window behind him, found his way to the living area, and started to place the gifts. Then he heard the gasp. Chris wheeled around towards the hallway to the bedrooms and found Samantha there, standing with an empty cup, house suation. In full Santa garb, He waited without breathing to see if he would be recognized. Santa? Samantha questioned, as she rubbed an eye. Chris exhaled. Why yes, little one. He smoothed, that would be me. I didn't think you were real. Why it's okay, Samantha. Not many do anymore, but I'm happy to have changed your mind. Chris interrupted. Chris again waited with no breath. Me too. Samantha said, wide-eyed and apparently struggling to find the right things to say to a mythical being. Chris resumed breathing again, the adrenaline fading, as he began to think of how to get Samantha back to bed, so he could finish his plan. But just then, perhaps the single most unfortunate wardrobe malfunction since that one Super Bowl took place. As the adhesive beard fell from Chris's face, compromised by the fight-or-flight sweat, Samantha's jaw dropped open. Uncle Chris. She exclaimed. SHHHHHHHHH. Chris held his finger to his mouth as he shushed her, the adrenaline surging back. He thought quickly, desperate to preserve his masterpiece. Part B. Run Rudolph, so Chris resolved to take her. He did not consider the consequence. All Chris could think is that if Samantha told her father what she saw, his plan would unravel. Yeah, Sam, it's me. Why aren't you in bed? He had asked. I heard a noise. Daddy tells us that Santa isn't real, but I thought maybe he was wrong. But it's just you. The lie came to his lips as a final piece of a puzzle that locks in with its comrades. Destiny again, Chris thought. Oh, but Sam. Chris whispered, your dad says all that stuff so that no one suspects. I am Santa Claus. Samantha's face showed the delight that only an 8-year-old could. Chris didn't have to try very hard. If you can keep a secret, I'll take you to see the reindeer, right now. He cooed. Samantha nodded with the enthusiasm of a hummingbird sipping Coca-Cola. So Chris took her by the hand and led her outside, back through the window he'd entered through. He had to keep the plan together, for Michael, and for Jonathan. He took the gift for Samantha with him, thinking that perhaps an easy bake oven would be a good distraction for her as he calculated. He led her down the walk to the car, again careful to avoid the street lamp. Samantha, of course, kept asking why there weren't any reindeer, and why he hadn't used the chimney. Chris absent-mindedly kept saying he didn't always use either as he tried to bring some sort of plan B into focus. The easily procured contentment of an 8-year-old once again saved him. He got Samantha into the car and began to carefully navigate the freshly plowed streets back to his apartment. Once there, he told Samantha that because she had seen him, plans for the evening had changed. He would have his elves finish up for him this year, and it was important that she be patient, because they wouldn't be able to return for a day or two to retrieve them and take them back to the North Pole. He gave her the easy bake oven, and left her in his tiny living room while he went into the bathroom. His plan was beginning to coalesce. Chris grabbed several of the Xanax tablets he had left over behind his mirror from his years of psychiatry visits, and used a glass to smash them into powder on the countertop. He scooped the powder into the now empty pill container, and pocketed it. No way would Samantha cooperate when he started driving her out of town. Next, he went to the closet and opened his small Walmart-bought safe. In it, he kept a large sum of cash, wary of the next time the economy crashed and the banks screwed everyone. He was in security after all. He would withdraw what was in his accounts later. The banks would be closed on Christmas anyway. He went to the tap and filled a glass with water. He poured in the powdered Xanax and stirred as he took it into the main room. Samantha was still trying to figure out how to use the oven, not realizing that the brownie mixes that came with it were long expired. He offered the water. "Just realized I interrupted you before you got your water earlier," Chris said, with the sweetest voice he could muster. "Oh, thanks," Samantha said. As she drank, she paused occasionally to ask questions about the North Pole. How many elves were there? How do reindeer fly? How long does it take to make the gifts? Chris had a smooth answer for each, pandering to her as she finished the cocktail. Finally, the glass empty, he took it and returned to the kitchen. He busied himself with packing and mapping his route to Canada, while he waited for the drugs to take effect. About 30 minutes later, he peeked around the corner from the kitchen to the living room, and smiled as he found Samantha sleeping soundly on the floor. He hoisted her over his shoulder, just like Santa and his sack, and took her to the car. He returned once more for the suitcase he had packed with all of the essentials. Taking one more look around to the apartment he knew he would never see again, he found comfort in knowing he was doing the right thing. The car pointed north. Chris had a long drive to the Canadian border. He would have to cross 3 states to get there, but he needed to get as far as he could before anyone realized Samantha was missing. Jonathan and the rest of his family would probably be waking in the next couple of hours and be terribly upset, to say the least. But wait. Oh, how could he have been so stupid? What would Jonathan think if Chris had disappeared at the same time his daughter had? No, that simply would not do. He would certainly be suspected then, whether or not Michael's gift did its job. No, he had to have a talk with Samantha, get her to understand. He brought the car back around to the south. His plan required he be present, as if nothing had happened. But could he really depend on an 8-year-old to keep his secret? Chris thought not. He hated how complex this had all become. And then, another thought came to him. In the past, Chris had experienced a lot of short-term memory loss when he took the Xanax. In fact, that's why he'd quit taking it. What if it had the same effect on Samantha? Even if it didn't, what if he could get her back into her own bed while she was knocked out? Then, anything she did remember was just a very vivid dream. Short of keeping Samantha hidden somewhere, it was the only way out he saw that still achieved the effect he wanted. It would be close, but Chris had to get Samantha back into her bed. He sped back to Jonathan's neighborhood, arriving just before 5 o'clock in the morning. He took Samantha out of the back seat and moved as quickly as he could back to the back window. He went first and pulled Samantha in behind him. Geez, Chris thought, she was really out. He took her down the hall as hastily as he could while still being silent, and placed her in her bed. As he left, he took one look back, the pride of a job well done swelling in his chest. Part by. Ghost of Christmas Past at 7 o'clock on Christmas Day, Michael sat bolt upright in his bed, looked outside at the growing light of morning, and hopped across the hall to his sister's room. "Sammy, get up, it's Christmas," he exclaimed. There was no response from Samantha. Michael pulled the blanket back, shaking her. When she didn't budge, even Michael's young mind knew something was amiss. He tried for a few more seconds, and noticed how stiff Samantha was, like she was frozen. As fear began to take over, he ran as fast as his short coverall pajama-clad legs would take him to his parents' bedroom. "Daddy. Mommy. Sammy is sick, she won't get up," he cried, as he shook Jonathan awake. "WH. What?" Jonathan yawned, as he came out of a deep sleep. Michael continued to share his dismay, Jonathan never really thinking anything was wrong until he got his glasses on and saw the look on his son's face. After that, instinct took over, and he leapt out of the bed. "Molly, wake up, something's wrong," he yelled as he strode to the door and down the hall to his daughter's room. He entered Samantha's room and knew from her color something was gravely awry. He did what any parent would, shaking her. When that didn't work, he checked for breathing. There was none. "Molly, call 911. His voice cracked as he started doing chest compressions. Part 5. And to all a good night. Chris got a phone call around noon on Christmas Day, coming out of the sleep of a full night's work. His sister-in-law spoke as he muttered a hello. "Chris, something awful has happened." She sobbed, and after a long pause she finished, "Michael found Samantha in her bed this morning. She died in her SLSL sleep." She broke down as she finished her thought. Chris sat bolt upright, his hand over his mouth. What had he done? It only took a moment for him to realize his error. The Xanax was too much. He'd euthanized her. Tears began running down his face. "Oh my God, Molly." Yet, the self-preservation instinct was strong. He had to lie if he wanted his plan to work, and there was still hope it would. Eventually, Michael would realize that he had a gift from Santa, and so would Jonathan. He'd been careful, and his only loose end had been silenced forever, albeit unintentionally. "What happened, Molly? Is Michael okay?" he asked. And so it went. A week later, Chris walked into the wake for Samantha, not having to fake sadness. He had loved her dearly. But she had died for the greater good. Yes, this would be painful for some time to everyone, but the intended outcome of his design had already started to take hold. Jonathan had let Michael open his gifts as a distraction. He didn't know what to make of it. Michael, of course, was convinced it came from Santa. Jonathan was not. Chris overheard him talking about it with some family friends in a hushed tone. He approached cautiously. "Jonathan." Chris couldn't finish. Jonathan stared at him a moment, Chris seeing what was coming. He had made a terrible miscalculation. "Was this you?" Jonathan bellowed, grabbing Chris by the tie. What do you mean?" Chris stammered, retreating. Several attendees rushed in to pull Jonathan from Chris, Jonathan screaming about the gift, and how he knew Chris had somehow been involved. "Explain the gift, Chris." He kept screaming, falling to his knees. Chris cowered, and he fled outside. Molly chased him. "Chris, I'm so sorry. He's just in so much pain." "We both are," she said. "It's okay, Molly. He's always hated me," Chris replied. Molly looked at him, heartbroken not only for her daughter, but for Chris as well. She watched him walk to his car, and then went back inside. Another few days went by, and Chris went back to his life. His co-workers sent condolences, his desk covered in cards and flowers each day when he came in. Slowly, he thought, things would turn out how he liked. Jonathan would see no other explanation. Santa would be real, and Chris would receive the forgiveness he'd purchased with Samantha's life. His desk phone rang. It was Molly again. "Chris, the police took Jonathan in for questioning this morning." "I don't know what to do," she deadpanned, clearly in some sort of shock. The autopsy on Samantha had been completed. Of course, her blood had been tested, and the Xanax had been there in gratuitous amounts. Unbeknownst to Chris, Jonathan also had a prescription for Xanax. In the end, the police decided they didn't have enough to actually arrest anyone. Jonathan and Molly didn't seem the type to intentionally poison their children, and no one could ask Samantha if she'd taken them on her own. Also, there was the question of the unexplained gift, lending credence that there had been an intruder. Jonathan did eventually come off of accusing Chris, telling him that despite their differences, he knew Chris loved the children and wouldn't hurt them on purpose. The police canvassed everyone living on the street, to no avail. Chris had been thorough and lucky. That February, Chris was invited over for coffee, Jonathan softened by his grief, and Molly still pushing for the brothers to have a relationship. They sat in the living room, Michael on the floor playing with his Hot Wheels. Eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned to Samantha. "I still can't sleep, knowing someone was in this house, and no one will do anything about it," Jonathan said, quietly to avoid Michael overhearing. He heard anyway. "Someone was here, Daddy," he said, without even looking up from his toys. "Santa did it." Santa hurt Samantha. Oh, how perfect, Chris thought. Eyewitness report transcript. Rustic Farms, New Hampshire discovery site. Witness: Richard A. Fabian. "I had always wanted to hike. Like really hike. None of these trails are pathways. Those are too linear. When I was little, my dad took me through a forest, and it was the most exhilarating hike I'd ever been on. The animals we saw, the plants, the views. They remained unmatched in my mind for far too long. I finally had a chance to take my son off trail yesterday morning. I told my wife we were going to stay on the clearest path, but after we parked and I saw the woods, thoughts of that hike with my father came flooding back. I changed my mind quickly after that. The woods before us were thick, lush, breathtaking. This was my chance to take my son on the adventure of a lifetime, the same way my father took me. Had I known what we would eventually see, maybe I would have chosen to stay on the trails. No, I definitely would have. We were off the trail for a solid 2 or 3 hours. Brian was hanging in there. He may be young, but he was determined. I did ask him at one point if he'd rather go back to the trail, and he made me so proud by saying, "You don't see the real wilderness from the trail, Dad." It was something I'd told him before, and he remembered. We were both on the same page. The first thing I saw was the old, mangled fence. It was rusted, and mostly smashed down to the ground, embedded in some weeds and grass. We followed the fence to a metal stake that once held it upright. We came across at least 3 or 4 more of those stakes before I saw the sign. Rustic Farms, population 3,622. It was an old sign. The corners were rusted and flaking off. The ink the words were printed with was mostly faded, but still legible. There were 2 bullet holes through it as well. Target practice, or missed shots at something else that is up for debate. Curiosity got the best of me at that point. I'd never heard of Rustic Farms, and I'd been coming to this general area since I was very young. We pressed forward on my instructions. We came, next, to the first skull. It was a dog's skull, although I am not sure of the breed. After seeing a couple more bones scattered about, Brian started to get nervous. He wanted to go back to the trail at this point, but selfishly I said the trail was too far to get back to right now. I said I wanted to see if there was anything else left of whatever Rustic Farms once was. We continued through the woods for another 15 or 20 minutes before I saw the first house. It was old, decrepit, and hidden within the trees. The growth of nature around it served as an almost perfect camouflage. We approached the house. I would have placed it maybe in the colonial times, but I'm not sure. There was broken glass outside of the door, maybe from a jar or bottle. The door had completely deteriorated, and the house seemed infested with bugs. Termites probably, considering the heavy structural damage. I told Brian to stay outside while I took a quick look inside. I didn't plan on going too far into the house. I may be adventurous, but I know an unstable floor when I see one. The house seemed frozen in time almost, from that colonial era. There were still candles on the tables, whittled cups, pots and pans. I tripped over the bones. When I looked down, there was a human skeleton, laying on its back, looking up at me. Its mouth was agape, and the skeleton appeared to have fused with the floorboards over time. They'd become one. I ran back out of the house, and saw Brian a few yards away. I called for him, but he hurriedly waved me over to him. When I got beside him, he pointed at another hidden house, almost identical to the one I had just been in. I went out to this second house as well, where glass had also been shattered just outside the door. I peeked in, and even though it was dark inside, the sunlight was just enough for me to see more human skeletons. We left immediately after that. When we finally got back into town, I called the authorities. I told them what I saw, and was asked to escort a small group of investigators to the location. It wasn't long before an entire army of investigators and crime scene technicians swarmed the scene. They uncovered a dozen more homes, shops, and horse stables within a few miles of where I took them. Rustic Farms appeared to have been a town that went extinct in modern times, without anyone even knowing about it. I wish I knew why. All those people were dead, and no one knew anything about them. It was sad. Hopefully one day, the families of those Rustic Farm citizens will at least be made aware. It's scary not knowing what happened there. Part 1. 3 years later, it was a scorching summer. Even the playful music spinning from the ice cream truck wasn't enough to lure the children out of their homes. The pavement sizzled, and the grass browned. The air was dry, and the drought in southern Wisconsin had finally taken its toll on the community. At the age of 30, Felix Ryder had found himself living back in his parents' house in Burroughs, Wisconsin, a quiet farming community located 50 miles west of Madison. He sat at the kitchen table with the job listings open in front of him. He knew he'd probably have better luck searching online, but it didn't hurt to look everywhere. A diamond in the rough was exactly what he was after. Grace, his mother, hobbled into the kitchen with the help of a wooden cane. She stopped and watched her son finger through the pages. It wasn't his fault the company he worked for went under. But it was definitely time to start looking hard again for work. His beard and hair were starting to remind her of a wild animal. "Any luck?" she asked. Felix was unaware his mother was there. He fixed his glasses. "I just started looking again." He took a sip of his water and gently sat it back down on the table. His mother joined him at the table. She was there for support, as a mother should be. But to Felix, she was lingering. Too close. At 30 years old, the last thing he expected to be doing was living in his parents' basement. No job, no girlfriend, nowhere to live. This wasn't the life he'd been hoping for. Now he was home again, silently putting up with his mother's lingering and his father's obsessive collecting, which one could argue bordered on hoarding. The garage was filled with, for a lack of a better term, crap. As was the attic. And if the basement didn't need to be cleared out for his arrival 3 weeks ago, Felix was sure the basement would have been quite the disastrous sight as well. Felix looked up at his mother, who smiled at him. "You sleep okay, Mom?" "No. I don't remember the last time I had a good night's sleep. Definitely before you were born," she joked. Felix gave her a pity laugh, but he wasn't really in the mood for jokes. "How about you? Is the basement comfortable enough?" Felix nodded. I'm hoping not to be in your hair for much longer. You're not in our hair. Grace smiled, resting her wrinkled hand on Felix's. It's nice to have you home again. We don't see nearly enough of you anymore. You have your own life in the big city. He politely pulled his hand away from under his mother's and used it to grab his cup of water. He took another forced sip and then sat it back down in the same wet ring he'd picked it up from. The days seemed to drag. There wasn't enough to do around Burroughs, and the extreme heat made it difficult to even get out of the house. But Felix forced himself to. He'd rather suffer through the heat than be confined to the house where his parents were. They weren't bad people, but he had already done his time. As it was, he didn't even make them empty nesters until he was in his early 20s. A delay in ambition on his part was to blame. But when he finally broke free, he never planned to come back. Life blindsided him. Felix walked through the old town of Burroughs. It was quite small, but appropriate for the size of the population. It was a farming town and exported corn and wheat almost daily during the prime seasons. Burroughs was widely known for the Mason Dairy Farm, the town's flagship industry. But with the drought, most of the crops had died, and the farmers couldn't do much until a heavy rain would fall. That left the cows on the dairy farm struggling to eat appropriately, which severely hindered the milk supply. Aside from a couple of cars that passed him by, he didn't see many other people out and about. Felix walked to the corner where an ice cream shop sat. There was a help wanted sign in the window, but he wasn't that desperate yet. He looked through the pane glass window and saw the old man inside, smiling and waving him in. What the hell? Felix thought. He walked into the shop and the bells chimed. It was much cooler inside, which was a relief, but he wasn't much of an ice cream guy. You're my first customer today. The old man smiled. And you lured me in. Felix laughed. Buy a scope, and I'll slap another one on for free. Felix stood at the counter and looked at the dozen or more flavors beneath the glass. It was colorful, but still not incredibly appealing. Felix was more of a chips and salsa guy than one for the sweets. He kept it as simple as possible. Vanilla, please. You got it. The old man happily prepared the waffle cone with 2 scoops, just as he promised. He even added sprinkles and whipped cream, and topped it off with a dripping cherry from a plastic jar. Felix finished the cone in minutes after leaving the shop. He used the napkin the old man supplied to wipe the drips off of his hand, and disposed of it in a public trash can at the corner. He looked around, contemplating his next move, but he couldn't think of one. Boredom was a huge factor in him leaving Burroughs to begin with. It was all coming back to him now. He walked back to his family's farm, only about a quarter of a mile from downtown Burroughs, and saw a mail truck parked in front. The mail carrier, a middle-aged woman wearing the standard blue cotton uniform, stood at the front door holding a dark box and a stack of mail that was rubber-banded together. It looked like she'd been standing there for some time, but neither of his parents were answering the door. Felix picked up his pace in an attempt to keep the woman from waiting any longer than she had to. "Hey there," he called out. The mail carrier turned and looked. "Sorry, it's my parents' house. Are they not answering?" "No, I've waited longer than I probably should," the woman said. "This package needs a signature though. I was hoping to catch them. I'm Felix, their son. I can sign for it." The carrier handed Felix the scanner, and he signed his name. The device beeped after accepting the signature, and he handed it back to her. "Thank you," she said with a warm smile. "Have a nice day, now. You as well." The mail carrier climbed back into her little box truck, started the engine, and drove off. Felix stood at the door with the dark box and letters in his grip. He sat the mail down on the kitchen table and pushed the letters aside. The package interested him more. It was wrapped in black paper that appeared to be folded and creased many times over. A white sticker had the package addressed to Francis Ryder, and the return address was from someone named Juniper Rose, definitely an eBay seller of some kind. Felix shook his head, wondering what kind of garbage his father had ordered this time. Speaking of which, where are they? He wondered. He walked to the living room but didn't see anyone. He then went to the bottom of the stairs. Mom? Dad? There was no answer from either of them. A loud thud then grabbed his attention, and he rushed to the side window. He pulled the curtains back and saw his dad standing out at the barn, holding his arm which appeared to be red. Fearing the worst, Felix rushed outside. His dad was working in the barn, trying to fix a gate, when he sliced his forearm against an exposed nail. Felix hurried to grab the cleanest rag he could find and wrapped it around his dad's arm. "Are you okay? What happened?" His dad laughed. "Just clumsy these days." Felix looked into the barn at the wooded gate his father had been working on. It wasn't as pristine as his past work. It was crooked and the nails were bent, so they didn't go all the way in. Felix looked back at his father. He was older, definitely not the man he used to be. But age was the culprit here. He'd been losing his hair for quite some time, something that Felix feared for himself as well as each year ticked by, and was slow to get around. His eyes looked permanently tired, and he had a slight shake in his hand that made Felix a little nervous. "Let's get you inside, Dad. I'll help you clean this up." Felix helped his father through the yard and into the house. At the kitchen sink, where the wound was tended to, Felix wrapped his dad's arm in a bandage he found under the sink. He dried off the area around the bandage one more time and helped his dad sit down in a chair at the table. "Where's Mom?" "I think her Rosemary picked her up for lunch." Felix nodded. Rosemary had been his mother's best friend since the 70s. At least he knew she was in good hands. Francis finally noticed the box on the table, wrapped in the black crinkly paper. "What's this?" "Came in the mail. Looks like an eBay order." Francis pulled the package closer and saw it was from Juniper Rose. He smiled. "It is. It's a collection from the Rustic Farms Discovery." Felix looked confused. "What's that?" His dad's eyes lit up. It was a fantastic find a few years back. "Historic, really. I'm surprised you haven't heard of it." Francis tore through the black paper to reveal a sealed cardboard box. As he opened the box, he explained. "A few years ago, a father and son were hiking deep in a New England forest. They came across the remains of an old town, completely unknown to anyone. It was overgrown and infested with bugs and animals. It's like the town had gone completely extinct. Rustic Farms. That was the town name. Yes. They found a sign. Then they found homes and bones. But no explanation. They dated the town back to the 1800s. Francis opened the box to reveal a small grouping of individually sealed items. Felix looked in with curiosity. They didn't know what to do with the recovered items from the town. Anything that wasn't interesting or important, that is. They auctioned them all off, and now this guy, Juniper Rose, sells grab bag groupings of the items. Basically keepsakes for anyone to claim they own mysterious pieces of history. Francis pulled out the first sealed item. It was a candle. Half melted, wrapped in a golden twine. Francis smiled at it and then set it aside before pulling out a wooden spoon. The spoon was bent very unnaturally, possibly due to aging and deterioration. He set it aside as well and then pulled out what appeared to be a baseball-sized marble. It swirled with many colors, most of them darker, and seemed to rattle like it held smaller marbles or other items inside of it. Francis sat it down and reached in for the last item. Felix picked up the sealed marble and looked at it carefully. "Dad, how much did you spend on this crap?" "It's not crap. It's part of an unknown place in North American history. This stuff will be very sought after one day. And we loan it." Although Felix didn't agree with the desperate purchase, it wasn't his money. He looked the marble all over, gently shaking it to hear the things inside. He noticed the exterior of the marble was fully intact. "How did they seal this?" "I don't see where it was put together." "I don't know," Francis said, not even paying attention. He was too busy looking at the last item, a rusted pair of scissors that seemed cracked or broken in numerous spots. Felix shook his head and sat the marble back down. Francis was more than pleased with his package. He put everything back in the box and folded the top back over. "I'll probably order more of these." "I'm sure you will." As the evening settled over Burroughs, Grace came home and prepared chicken stew for dinner. The three of them ate the stew and homemade bread, and each retired to their rooms for the night. When Felix walked down the creaking steps to his basement room, he saw the box of Rustic Farms items. It had begun. His space was being taken over by his father's compulsive hoarding. "I wonder when he'll ever look into this box again," Felix thought. He picked up the box and moved it to the back room where the water heater was. He sat it on the floor, closed the door, and plopped down on his bed. The days were blending together. Tomorrow would be another day to look for a job. Tomorrow would be another day with the hopes of leaving his parents' house once again. He closed his eyes as darkness fell over Burroughs. Felix was awoken suddenly to the sound of his mother screaming and stumbling across the floor above him, ending with a loud thud. He ripped the covers off and flew up the stairs to his mother's aid. The first thing he saw was blood on the floor and stained on the carpet. He saw his mother on the floor, propped up against the wall near the television. Her cane was a few feet away, and he saw the blood coming from her feet. He quickly was able to follow the bloody footprints back to the open front door. He rushed to her side and helped her into the closest chair. "Are you okay?" Grace was crying. "It hurts." He looked at the bottom of her feet where small shards of glass were stuck right into the skin. He didn't understand. What happened? He looked back at the front door, catching a glimpse of the shimmering broken glass on the doormat outside. "I didn't even see it there." Grace said of the broken glass. "It must have fallen out of the trash can when your father took it out yesterday." "That was in the afternoon," Felix said. "Was it there when you came home last night?" "I don't think so." She winced as the blood continued to steadily trickle out of the bottoms of her feet. "I need to take you to the doctor." Felix stood up and went to the front door. The glass looked like the remnants of a bottle. The bottom part of it was still mostly intact, but the top part was shattered and speckled with Grace's blood. An odor entered Felix's nostrils, a sour, rotten scent. He cringed at the overwhelming stench, and then quickly brushed it aside in order to help his mother. Dr. Hummel, a local family doctor so close to retirement, extracted the glass from Grace's feet, stitched them where necessary, and bandaged them up. He supplied her with a wheelchair to borrow, and suggested she stayed off her feet for a few days, until the tenderness went away. "I'll write a prescription to the pharmacy for some painkillers, Grace." Dr. Hummel said. Those should do wonders for you. Thank you, Dr. Hummel. Grace said with an appreciative smile. He nodded and scribbled on a prescription pad. He sloppily signed his name and handed Felix the slip. Pamper your mother, Felix. Hummel said. I want her on the couch or bed with a good TV movie and some soup. Rest is the best medicine. Felix nodded with a smile. He folded the slip and stuffed it in his pocket. Thank you. Felix wheeled Grace to the car where Francis kept the air conditioning running. Felix struggled to help his mother into the passenger seat, but eventually succeeded without the help of his father. Francis remained in the driver's seat, listening to the weather report on the radio. Felix folded up the wheelchair, popped it in the trunk, and climbed into the back seat. No end in sight, Felix. Francis said. What do you mean? The drought. Weatherman says at least another 5 days of heat. We're all doomed to die this summer. Francis laughed. Mom's going to be okay. Felix said, annoyed that his father didn't even ask her acknowledge her being back in the car. Rest and painkillers. Francis looked to his wife with a smile. Good to hear, honey. She smiled back, almost like she expected that kind of response from him. As Francis shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb, Felix looked out the window as a young man was helping his wife out of the passenger seat of another car. Her feet appeared to have been covered in blood as well. Strange, Felix thought. Grace was set up on the couch, in front of a Lifetime original movie, and leftover chicken stew. Do you need anything else right now, Mom? She smiled. I should be okay. I have the bell. She playfully shook the small bell on the table next her. I'll be in as soon as you ring it. She sat the bell back down and Felix left the room. He went to the kitchen where he poured himself a glass of fresh lemonade and drank it at the window. He watched as his father walked into the barn with a shovel. Curious, he thought. Felix walked into the barn and saw his father sitting on a bale of hay with a dirty shovel in his hand. He looked tired or confused. Dad. Are you okay? Francis looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and his pupils were large. Concerned, Felix rushed to his father's side. What's wrong? Just a little tired, his father said. Farm life has taken its toll on this old man. What were you doing? Francis looked around and drew a blank. He looked at the shovel and saw dirt caked onto the chipped spade, but couldn't for the life of him remember why he had it. His father's silence said everything. Felix feared this day, the day his parents would eventually go downhill. Their health was not what it used to be, and it was becoming clearer that they wouldn't be able to live on their own much longer. A cool breeze blew through the open barn door and brought momentary relief from the extreme heat. But it also carried the same sour odor Felix had smelled that morning. What's that smell, Dad? Francis sniffed the air and made a strange face. It's terrible. Like sour milk or something. Smells like something's dead out there. Have you killed any animals on the farm in the past few days? Francis shook his head. I don't think so. Felix walked to the barn door and looked around the farm. Nothing stood out to him as abnormal. The trees blew gently, and the weather vane gently swayed on the roof of the house. If Burroughs couldn't have cooler temperatures, or even just rain, a breeze here and there was more than welcome. If only that stench didn't have to accompany it. They're not in good shape. Felix said over the phone. I'm starting to think I'm going to be here longer than I wanted to be. Well, the city misses you, Flex. The man on the other line said. It was Eric Humphrey, Felix's best friend from Green Bay, where he'd traveled from after losing his job. Packers are starting the preseason in 2 weeks. Anyway, you'll be back for the first game? Felix sighed. Doubt it. I'll probably just have to watch the grainy video from here. The reception out here is terrible, Eric. Burroughs is from another time. I wish I was there with you. Eric said, and then laughed. Very funny. Felix looked around the basement, which was only half finished. It was cooler down there than the rest of the house, but musty. A small box TV sat on top of two old milk crates that were stacked on top of one another. The exposed light bulb hanging from the ceiling was starting to lose its brightness, and the walls had random cracks here and there. The bed was the only thing even remotely comfortable about the room. I have to get out here, man. Pudgy's is hiring a full-time bartender. Eric said. Pudgy's? Felix laughed. Like the bar we frequent for games. Just a suggestion, man. You'd get killer tips, especially on ladies' night. Drunk girls tossing money around to the handsome bartender. You'd clean up. Felix confidently shook his head. No. I am not going from a moneybags position at tech corporation to passing drinks down a dirty bar to drunks who don't even know exactly how drunk they are. Eric sighed on the other line. You're too picky, Flex. Lower your standards, pal. I'll find a job on my own, Eric, thank you. Felix snapped. An uncomfortable silence flooded the phone. I have to go. Felix said, and hung up before Eric could even say goodbye. He slapped his phone down on the bed and stared up at the light bulb, which seemed to be dimming quickly. A quick flash inside the bulb blew it out, and the room fell into darkness. He then heard the bell from his mother upstairs. Felix closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This is my life now, he thought. The bell rang again. Coming. Felix walked through the living room where the room was darker than he thought it would be for only being the late afternoon. He noticed all the lights were out. He noticed the silence. Mom? The TV went out, Felix. She groggily said from the chair. He walked to the TV and saw it was still plugged in. Power must be out. The light downstairs blew too. Felix walked to the window, where he saw a dark cloud slowly crawling across the sky in the distance. The weatherman was wrong. What? Grace asked. The weatherman on the radio. He said the drought would continue. I see dark clouds coming. It might rain. Maybe even a storm. Grace didn't respond. Felix turned around. Mom? He said. He walked closer and saw her face. She looked sick. She was as pale as a ghost, and beads of sweat had formed on her forehead. Mom? He looked to her feet and saw blood had saturated through the bandages. Felix quickly grabbed a blanket off the back of the couch and wrapped it around her feet. All right, he said, trying to remain calm. I think the cuts are infected. I'm going to call Dr. Hummel. Mom? He moved her head around, but she wasn't responding. Mom? He tried again, more frantically. Dad? He called out loudly. Francis emerged from the kitchen, seemingly disoriented. Everything okay? He slurred. Dad? Francis stumbled into the living room and collapsed into the coffee table, breaking it in half and crumbling to the floor. Dad? Felix sat his father up and tried to snap him back into consciousness, but it was no use. Francis passed out, and Felix gently laid him back onto the floor. He rushed back to Grace, and she had also completely passed out. The blood was soaking through the blanket and pooling on the floor beneath her. Felix dialed 911 on his phone. When the paramedics arrived, they told Felix to wait outside. An old pickup truck pulled up in front of the house, and the small-town Dr. Hummel climbed out, rushing up to the porch. "What's happened?" Hummel asked. "I think my mom had an infection. She started bleeding everywhere and passed out. Something was wrong with my dad too. He passed out also." "Had he been hurt?" "No. Wait. He did cut himself on a nail yesterday, but it wasn't very deep. And come to think of it, he seemed disoriented earlier today too. Like he forgot where he was and what he was doing." "Huh." Dr. Hummel mumbled. He looked into the house to see if the paramedics had assessed the couple yet. "Dr. Hummel, did you have another patient after us with cuts to their feet too?" "That's confidential information," Dr. Hummel said. His look then told Felix everything he needed to know. He put two and two together and found the similar injuries odd. Was it glass? On a porch, by chance? Hummel looked right into Felix's eyes. It was a strange revelation. One of the paramedics emerged from the house and put his hand on Felix's shoulder. He looked deeply bothered. "Are they okay?" Felix asked. "They didn't make it, Mr. Ryder," the paramedic said. Felix didn't understand. "What? They've passed on." Felix was overcome by a million thoughts. He started to tremble and dropped to his knees. "Both of them?" he softly mouthed to himself. A distant rumble of thunder brought his attention back to the dark clouds in the distance. The paramedic looked up and saw dull flashes of lightning within the clouds. "We need to get them out of here," the paramedic said. "I can call the coroner for you," Hummel said, remaining sympathetic. Felix remained on his knees, unable to focus his emotions on just one. The clouds inched closer to Burroughs, making the sky darker and darker by the minute. 2 hours had passed since his parents were both pronounced dead, and Felix remained in the house, gathering cleaning chemicals to get the blood out of the carpet. It seemed sick that he was responsible for this part of it. But Burroughs wasn't a big city like Green Bay. They didn't have the forensic resources. A soft beep echoed through the quiet house, and Felix recognized it immediately. It was his phone losing battery power. He grabbed it off the counter and plugged it into the wall to charge, but it didn't connect. The power was still out. He tore it out of the wall and collapsed to the ground, scooting back against the wall, and finally broke down. Felix cried and sulked. His stomach hurt from the crying and the pain of the unexpected events of the day. His parents were gone. What were the chances of both of them passing at the same time? It doesn't make sense, he thought. A rumble of thunder in the distance lightly shook the house. The dishes in the kitchen cabinet rattled, and Felix looked to the window. It was becoming darker. He stood up and made his way to the front door. He opened it, quickly looking at the welcome mat where the glass had been, and then looked across his parents' land and at the black clouds maliciously lurking in the sky. The dead cornfield swayed gently in the breeze, and the homemade wind chimes jingled on the porch. The old wooden windmill out in the field started to spin, and then turn. It faced the farmhouse, and the blades picked up speed. A familiar sour stench crawled across the farm and hit Felix's senses with an unforgiving punch. He covered his mouth and nose and rushed back into the house. He closed the door and locked it. He became overwhelmed with a feeling of dread. Like something bad was about to happen. The clouds outside were as black as night, and the odor that filled the farm was nauseating. Felix could hear the wind chimes clashing back and forth, and then a snap sent them crashing to the wooden planks of the porch. An emergency alert sent his cell phone dancing across the floor with the sudden, sporadic vibrations. He grabbed the phone from the ground and looked at the red alert screen. This is an alert from the National. The screen glitched and went black before he could read the rest. A loud, earth-shaking clap of thunder sent Felix's heart almost through his chest. He jumped and frantically looked around. He rushed to the window and saw the entire sky had become black, overtaken by the strange clouds. His heartbeat picked up. Felix could hear it in his ears. Thump, thump, thump. His jaw trembled, and he became scared. Frightened. He'd never been afraid of storms before. Why was this one any different? Felix dashed for the basement door and shuffled rapidly down the stairs and into the darkness below the house. He climbed into bed and threw the blankets over his head, shivering in fear beneath them. It was what a child would do, not a grown man in the real world. But this didn't feel like the real world. Felix was overcome with a surreal sensation. He'd become dizzy. His vision was spinning, dipping in and out of blurriness. He closed his eyes and felt like he was falling. Help. He tried to call out, but not even he could hear his own voice screaming. A searing pain then sliced through his head, snapped a nerve, and everything went silent. It was an unbalanced shuffling noise across the floor that woke him. It bothered him because there was supposed to be no one else in the house. Felix awoke, but didn't open his eyes just yet. They were still heavy, and he felt nauseous. He was hot, breathing in and out under the heavy blankets for what felt like hours. It smelled musty. Like sweat. The shuffling noise seemed to pass by him as he continued to lay under the sheets on his bed. Whatever it was slow moving, which stood out even more because of the overwhelming silence that surrounded him. He didn't even hear the thunder anymore. He did hear a beep though from his phone upstairs. It hadn't completely died yet. Felix thought about his parents. Were they still dead? Or was this just one terrible dream that he was finally waking up from? It all could have been passed off as a dream. His current life state, his parents' sudden passing, the scary as hell storm that came out of nowhere. Whatever was shuffling across the floor bumped into something, and it rattled. Maybe the TV on the milk crates. Felix knew he was awake now, so that noise was not a dream. It was real, and something was in the basement with him. He tried to lift his arm to pull the sheets back, but they too were heavy like bags of wet sand. He could barely move a muscle. They were locked up on him. He then heard the door to the back room creak open, painfully slow. Was it someone who came to check on him after the storm? An intruder? An animal? Hello? Felix tried to call out, but no words were vocalized. His body was shut down. He couldn't move or speak, but it wasn't on his own. Something was keeping him from communicating. If it was someone there to help, they were looking in the wrong place. There was nothing in that back room except junk his father had collected over the years. Help. Felix tried to say again, but barely had the strength to even open his mouth. He began to feel tired again. The stress of the situation brought on a strong fatigue. His vision blurred again, and his mind began to spin. Felix passed out again. Felix? Are you home? A man's voice called. In his dream state, Felix thought it was the voice of his father, but after it woke him up, he heard it again. Felix. And he knew it wasn't his father's voice. Felix sat up in his bed, and the sheets fell off him. They were soaked with sweat, and he felt clammy himself. He looked around the basement where sunlight was hazily coming through a small window high on the wall. It was morning. The storm, or whatever it was over. The nauseous feeling he'd felt all night was also gone, and now he was just hungry. He looked across the basement and saw the backroom door was wide open, and then he remembered the shuffling noise. Felix climbed out of bed and walked over to the backroom, peeking in. It was dark and quiet. He reached for the light switch just inside the door and flipped it. Nothing. He flipped it back and forth multiple times with the same results. The power was still out. "Felix? Are you here?" He heard the man's voice again, this time along with the floor creaking above him. He recognized the voice now. It was Dr. Hummel's voice. Felix rushed upstairs and saw Dr. Hummel standing in the living room, next to the couch where his mother had died a day earlier. Felix was still trying to shake off the confusion from the night. "What are you doing here?" Felix asked. Dr. Hummel stepped closer to Felix, looking him up and down with obvious concern. "You look terrible. Are you sick?" "Sit down, Felix." The friendly doctor helped Felix sit down on the couch and then started to visually examine him. "You look like hell, kid," he said. "Rough night, I guess. Let me get you some water." Dr. Hummel went to the kitchen and grabbed a glass from the cabinet. He filled it halfway with water from the tap and brought it back to Felix. Felix took a sip and didn't even realize how dry his mouth was until the water touched it. It was refreshing, and even though it was a small amount, it was rejuvenating. "Are you okay?" Dr. Hummel asked again. Felix nodded. "I was worried about you. After yesterday," Hummel said. "Power's out all over town, and you weren't answering your cell phone. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Felix looked to the floor where his phone was. It was close enough that he was able to lean down and pick it up. He tapped the screen a couple times and pressed the buttons on the side. It had finally died. "What kind of storm was that last night?" Felix asked. "I think I passed out. Not sure, actually. I've never seen anything like it. It was dark as hell, though. There was loud thunder, some strong winds, but that was it. No rain." Hummel chuckled. "We didn't get that lucky." Felix took another sip of water. "Was there anyone else here with you last night?" "No." "Why?" "The front door was wide open when I got here a bit ago. And that was sitting out there on your welcome mat." Hummel pointed to a small table by the front door. There was a small glass bottle. Felix gawked at it and stood up. He slowly approached it and picked it up. It was a milk bottle a couple centuries old if he had to guess. There was a dried white substance around the interior ring at the bottom of it. He put the open bottle to his nose and sniffed. His senses were immediately struck by a foul stench, and he viciously turned his head away from it. It was unmistakably sour milk. Very reminiscent of the odor he had smelled around the farm, only stronger because of its contained quarters within the bottle. Disgusted, he put it back on the table and turned to the doctor. "It was just sitting out there." "Yes. My mom stepped on glass yesterday. She probably stepped on a bottle and shattered it. That's what cut her." Hummel finally caved. There were multiple cases yesterday of people stepping on glass. They sound clumsy or oblivious, but there's no door-to-door milk delivery these days. No one would expect that. Who's leaving old milk bottles on porches? Dr. Hummel was just as stumped as Felix. "Have you checked on those other patients since you saw them?" "No, I haven't been into the office yet." Felix was overcome again with worry and dread. It rushed over him like an ocean, and in the pit of his stomach, he felt those other patients needed to be checked on right away. "Let's go to your office." Hummel was confused. "Why?" "I want you to check on the other patients." "Make sure they didn't get the infection like my mom did." Hummel nodded. Felix's concerns started to bleed into his own mind, and now he needed to know as well. He stood up from the couch and pulled his keys from his pocket. Traffic was congested throughout Burroughs. The street lights were out, and everyone was left to create their own order while driving through town. Hummel drove his truck through Burroughs and parked along the side of the road, just outside of his small corner office. Hummel and Felix hopped out of the truck and walked briskly to the front door of the office, which had been repurposed from a house at one point. The shutters on the windows and the porch swing by the door made it more of a cozy experience. They walked through the front door, and a young female receptionist greeted the two men with a friendly smile. "Good morning, Dr. Hummel," she said, eyeing Felix next. "Good morning, Sarah. Anyone come in yet?" Sarah shook her head. "No. The phones and computers are down. Everything's down, it's kind of crazy." She laughed. "Were there any messages from last night? Before the power went out?" "I don't know. If there was, I wouldn't be able to access them now." "Who were the other two patients with the gashes on their feet yesterday?" Sarah looked at Felix. She remembered him now. He'd brought his mother in for a similar injury. Sarah sifted through a stack of files on her desk. She found one almost immediately, and found the second one near the bottom of the stack. She handed the files to Hummel. These were the other two, aside from Grace Ryder. Hummel read the names on the front of the file. Gary Luther and Regina Cali. He looked at Felix and said, "Come on." With the two files in hand, Hummel walked back out of the office with Felix following him like a puppy. They drove across town, to Gary Luther's farm. He was a lone wheat farmer, who coincidentally had a field which backed up to the Ryder's farm. Dr. Hummel parked his truck next to a larger truck, and the two men climbed out. The farm was quiet. There didn't seem to be any wind coming across the land, so the windmill stood still, and the wind chimes on either side of the covered porch appeared frozen in time. A few chickens clucked from the henhouse around the side of Gary's home, and Felix noticed horses grazing in the mostly dead field of wheat. The front door to the house was open, so Dr. Hummel and Felix ascended the porch steps cautiously. At the doorway, they were met with yet another disgusting odor. This one was more decay and less sour. Hummel knew the odor immediately, and his professional experience told him what he would be walking in on. "Stay here," the doctor said. "But, what is please, Felix?" "Stay here." Hummel was pleading, so Felix reluctantly obliged and backed up. He watched as the doctor slowly crept into the house, carefully watching his footing, and disappeared around the corner. Felix stood back and glanced out amongst the land. The farm was set up similar to his family's, but was by far larger. The wheat field stretched way off into the horizon and became one with the sky. Gary Luther even had scarecrows perched every couple acres or so. Something that his parents never bothered to do. His mom never liked the looks of them. "They're too scary," she would say. But wasn't that the point? Dr. Hummel came back out from inside the house. He held a handkerchief over his mouth and nose. Felix knew what the damage was, but Dr. Hummel confirmed it. "He's dead. On the floor." Felix poked his head in the door anyway, and saw Gary Luther, a middle-aged lifetime farmer, dead on the floor. Blood was pooled beneath his feet, and his body had succumbed to rigor mortis. He lay on his back with his hands sticking up like bent claws. His eyes were closed, his mouth was closed, and flies buzzed around the corpse. Felix fled back down the porch. "We need to tell the police. We need to check Regina Cali," Dr. Hummel firmly stated. He wanted all the facts before the local law enforcement. The drive to Regina's house was eerily quick. Out of Gary Luther's driveway, a sharp left turn, and a quarter of a mile south, took them right to the Callie household. It was at the edge of a small housing development known as Feather Falls. The mailbox with the flag still up and Callie printed on the side told them they were in the right place. Dr. Hummel parked along the curb, and right away they saw a man standing in the front yard, watering a potted plant by the front steps. As Felix and the doctor approached the man, he recognized Hummel. "Dr. Hummel?" the man asked, concerned by his seemingly random appearance. Hummel extended his hand and shook the young man's. "Timothy Callie, correct?" Timothy nodded. "How's your wife?" "She's resting," Timothy said. He sat the watering can down on the porch and then curiously looked at Felix and then the doctor again. "Do you normally do unannounced follow-ups at your patients' homes?" "No. I just have specific concerns about Regina's health. Has she shown any signs of infection? Or has the bleeding started again?" Timothy shook his head. "Not that I'm aware of. She wanted to rest, take a little nap. So I came out here and started doing some yard work, since that storm last night failed to give us any rain." "May I see her, Timothy?" Timothy grew uneasy. He was worried about the attention Dr. Hummel was putting on his wife. "She was fine 10 minutes ago, Doc. If anything changes, I'll call you." "Power's out all over town," Felix added. Timothy faced him next. "And what business do you have seeing my wife?" Felix didn't respond. Timothy turned back to the doctor one last time. "I'll call you if we need you, Dr. Hummel. I appreciate your concern. Have a good day." Mr. Callie shot Felix an evil eye and then picked up the watering can again. He went about his yard work, and Dr. Hummel climbed back into the truck with his passenger. "What now?" Felix asked. Hummel took a deep breath. "I don't know. Something does seem off though. Something's wrong here in Burroughs." Felix looked out the window and watched as Timothy watered the plants. A woman next door exited her house with her dog on a leash and began to speed walk down the sidewalk. A flock of birds flew overhead, and as they cleared the large Feather Falls sign, Felix noticed the dark clouds again, creeping just over the horizon. "Look," he said. Hummel leaned forward and looked out the passenger window. He saw the clouds too. They were pitch black, not like normal storm clouds. "I have to go to the police department to inform them about Gary Luther," Hummel said. "I'll drop you off back at your house first." "Okay," Felix said. He sat back in his seat and Hummel pulled away from the curb. Dr. Hummel dropped Felix off by his front porch and then drove away. Felix watched as the rocks and dirt were kicked up by the bald tires on the old truck, leaving a dusty trail in his wake as he disappeared around the bend. The dark clouds approached quicker this time, bringing the expected sudden gusts of wind. The windmill swayed out in the field, and the porch swing started to rock back and forth. Its metal hinges creaking loudly, and in desperate need of WD-40. Felix went inside and closed the door. Habit told him to flip the light switch, but when the lights didn't come on, he remembered. "Why is the power even out?" he thought. There was no lightning last night. There was certainly a curious string of events taking place, but they were all so hard to make sense of. Hard to even believe. The blood stain on the carpet made it all feel real though. His mother's blood. It had poured from the gashes in her feet. Gashes brought on by the shattered glass of a centuries-old milk bottle randomly placed at their doorstep. Felix thought for a moment. Who would have access to those bottles? There was only one dairy farm in town, and it was run by Stitched Mason and his boys. If anyone would have access to vintage milk bottles, like the ones showing up around town, it'd be them for sure. A rumble of thunder shook the house. Felix looked out the window. The sky was pitch black again. Felix studied the clouds more closely this time. They were long and wispy. Thousands of wispy strands made up the darkness above. They moved in so fast, commanding with the thunder that boomed from them. But aside from the wind, they didn't do anything else. No lightning, no funnel clouds, no precipitation. Nothing. What was the purpose of them, and where did they come from? They most certainly weren't a normal act of nature. The clouds encapsulated the entire sky. At least, as far as Felix could see. The darkness outside heavily shadowed the interior of the Ryder home. And then, just like that, the wind stopped. The porch swing stopped creaking. The wind chimes fell silent. Felix was left in the dark house with the overwhelming quiet. He could hear his heartbeat throbbing in his ears again. And it was picking up as the seconds crawled by. He started to feel the fear and dread again. The feeling was becoming too familiar and made Felix uncomfortable. As the dread built inside of him, threatening to blow at any moment, that's when the silence was broken. From outside, a distant cry emerged. Like a soft, extended howl from a wolf. But only it wasn't a wolf. It was distorted into an unnatural pitch and tone. It was animal-like, but Felix couldn't completely convince himself it was coming from an animal. Felix slowly approached the side window and looked out in the night-like darkness. Only subtle outlines of things could be seen. The edge of the barn, a slight reflection off of the windmill blades from who knew where. As his eyes adjusted, he focused on the cornfield. It was as still as a painting. He could make out the outline of the corn stalks, as well as the tractor sitting at the edge of the field. Then, some of the stalks moved. They crinkled and crunched, and sounded like they were right next to him. He watched from the house as a small section of the stalks at the edge began to bend forward, out from the rest of the field. The strange noise was back. It expressed itself like a high-pitched wind, howling through something hollow. Woo-all. The sound sent chills throughout Felix's body, making it feel like he was standing naked in below freezing temperatures. His nerves teetered on the edge, but he couldn't remove his eyes from the contorting corn stalks. The wool sound grew louder as the stalks continued to bend and crack, and finally snap. Long, dark appendages began to emerge from behind the bending crops, slithering out like snakes or tentacles, and waving in slow motion. Felix shot back away from the window and put his back against the wall. The wool sounded off again, even louder this time, shattering his nerves completely. What the hell is that? Felix's thoughts were a knot of frantic versions of the same question. It wasn't normal. None of this was. He crouched down between the couch and the wall, and tried to remain hidden in the shadows from whatever was creeping out of the cornfield. The wool seemed to fade out to silence again. Not even the crickets were chirping. Felix remained hidden. Just because he couldn't hear it anymore, didn't mean it wasn't still out there. The minutes began to go by, slowly at first, and then a little quicker. A cautious sense of relief fell over him, but he was still too nervous to stand from his spot. There was a thud on the front porch, followed by a dragging sound. And then it stopped. Felix tightened back up, trying to prepare for a sudden escape if the need were to arrive. Another thud hit the wooden floor of the porch outside, and was once again followed up by a dragging sound. Drag. Drag. Felix could tell it was moving across the porch and getting closer to the front door. He'd forgotten to lock it. Felix's muscles tensed up as he thought briefly about sneaking over to lock it, but then stopped. He wasn't sure it was worth the risk. Drag. It was now directly outside of the front door. It wasn't moving, but he could hear the floorboards creaking beneath its weight as it just stood there. Does it know I'm here? Felix thought as his heart raced. The whool erupted again, startling Felix to his feet. It was louder and bolder than before. It was much more menacing. Felix looked to his left and saw the door to the basement was open. He risked it and ran for the doorway. He clambered down the basement stairs and into the room. The first thing he noticed was the confusing glow in the room. It was a dull yellow, but he couldn't see where it was even coming from. Everything was hazy, but he could see well enough. The second thing he noticed was even more confusing. Standing by the foot of his twin bed was a boy. He wore a tattered cream-colored shirt with brown overalls pulled up over it. His shoes were dirty with caked-on mud, and his hair was greasy. He didn't appear well kept. "Where is it, mister?" the boy politely asked. Felix was in total shock. He didn't know this boy or have any idea what he was referring to. "Where is it?" the boy softly repeated. His voice was hollow and didn't have any emotion behind it. Felix slowly shook his head, not even believing his own eyes. "How'd you get in here?" Felix nervously asked. His voice trapped in a trembling whisper. The boy smiled, but it wasn't genuine. His eyes appeared black. "Francis let me in." Felix turned and saw his father standing at the bottom of the wooden stairs, gripping something in his hand. He was completely pale and looked all wrong. This wasn't his father. "Don't tell it," Francis whispered without moving his mouth. Felix didn't understand. He snapped his head back to the boy, who was gone and replaced by a hulking, smoky, distorted figure shrouded in black. "Tell it," it angrily gurgled in a deep, hellish tone. Felix forced himself back into the wall and dashed up the basement stairs as fast as he could, scared to death that the creeping horror behind him was only inches from grabbing him by the ankles and pulling him back down into the dark abyss. He shook uncontrollably as he burst into the living room and sloppily stumbled across the room to the front door. He threw the door open and rushed outside, where he was stopped by Dr. Hummel standing on the porch, facing him like a statue. He looked fake. Like a wax figure of himself. "Dr. Hummel?" Felix stuttered. Dr. Hummel then fell forward, crashing face down on the porch and gushing a fountain of blood from a giant gaping hole in his back. The blood sprayed up like a geyser and doused the porch, as well as Felix. He screamed as the dark clouds above seemed to rapidly dissipate, bringing daylight back to Burroughs. The sudden change stopped him mid-scream, and he looked down as Hummel continued to spill blood all over the porch. Part 2. Felix walked into town. He was covered from head to toe with the blood of Dr. Hummel, and he was lost in the mess of horrific images in his head. The ones he had just witnessed at his family's farm. He saw his father, he saw the boy, he saw Dr. Hummel. But what he didn't see was the thing crawling out from the cornfield. The unknown presence at the farm that terrified him. The whool that echoed through the darkness was appalling. It hit every nerve in his body. It was upsetting, uncomfortable, unnatural. As he walked through town in a confusing fog, that sound replayed over and over in his mind. It worried him, and he dreaded hearing it again. Felix shuffled up to the police department in the center of town. There was a small crowd of people standing outside. They seemed to be shouting at the building, trying to draw out the police. The scene didn't make sense to Felix as he wandered into the rowdy crowd. The dark blood staining his clothes, hair, and smearing his glasses drew frightened looks immediately. Some people screamed, some back away fearfully, but one man put his arm around Felix and helped him sit down on the curb. "Are you okay?" the man asked, genuinely concerned for Felix's well-being. The old man looked him up and down, trying to find a wound. "Where are you hurt?" "I'm not," Felix said. "This is Dr. Hummel's blood." "Dr. Hummel?" the man asked, putting up his guard. Felix looked the old man in the eye. "I didn't do anything to him. He came to my house. He was killed." The old man was trying to make sense of Felix's story. Felix then cocked his head at the old man. He recognized him from the ice cream shop. "You gave me the free scoop." The old man nodded and then looked up at the police station. He charged up to the front doors with authority, banging on them with all the strength his old bones could muster. "Open your doors. There's a man hurt out here. And Dr. Hummel is dead." The old man continued to bang on the doors loudly until they finally opened. A young officer in a blue uniform stood there with one hand on his holstered weapon. "What did you say?" the officer inquired, making sure he heard the muffled shouting correctly. The old man pointed down to Felix sitting on the curb, covered in blood. "Jesus Christ!" the young officer yelled as he rushed out to Felix's side. He helped him up and walked him into the police station. The old man winked and nodded to Felix as the doors closed once again. The police confiscated Felix's clothing, took his fingerprints, and read in his rights. He sat in a small, uncomfortable interrogation room, handcuffed and wearing a tan jumpsuit. His hair had been washed, and his glasses sat on the table, neatly folded up in front of him. He watched the clock on the wall, but it failed to move. The batteries must have been dead or something. 12:01 was its permanent time now. Felix noticed the room was muddy. Either the air wasn't reaching the vents, or they didn't have it turned on. That would have been surprising though, considering the extreme heat as of late in the area. Felix cracked his neck, and the pop sounded loud in the small room. The door then opened, and a detective walked in. He dressed the part, but opted to not have a jacket on, and had his sleeves rolled up. His bright gold watch sparkled under the lights above the table, as did the badge pinned on his belt. The detective removed the badge and sat it on the table. Felix looked at it. It was gold-plated, embedded in a torn brown leather casing. The detective cleared his throat, and Felix looked up. He missed the part where the detective had sat down. "I'm sorry?" Felix asked, feeling like he'd possibly missed something else. "I said I'm Detective Chuck Barnes. I want to ask you a few things about the deceased." "Who?" "Dr. Hummel." "Oh, okay. You have been read your rights, correct?" "Yes." Detective Barnes opened a small pad of paper and extracted a pen from his breast pocket. He clicked the pen and put the tip to the paper. A small spot of ink leaked from the tip and soaked into the paper. "Do you know Dr. Hummel personally? Or professionally?" "I took my mom to see him. She'd cut her feet really badly when she stepped on the glass." "And your mother died shortly after seeing Dr. Hummel?" "Yes." "Malpractice? Is that what you thought?" Felix was confused. "I'm sorry, what? Do you think Dr. Hummel provided insufficient care to your mother, resulting in her death?" Felix was stunned. He can't be serious, he thought. "Are you accusing me of killing Dr. Hummel?" Detective Barnes smiled and shrugged. "You were mad. You were angry. You had the motive, And when Dr. Hummel showed up at your doorstep, you ripped into his back and spilled his blood everywhere. No. Felix said. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. I didn't do that. Where is it? Barnes grew more aggressive, and Felix shook his head rapidly. Tell it. Barnes slammed his fists down on the table, splashing Felix's face. He instinctively closed his eyes and felt the warm liquid hit his forehead and cheeks and drip down. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands, chest and the table before him. They were all covered in blood. Felix looked up at Barnes, but there was no one sitting in front of him. The wool erupted once again, and Felix buried his head under his cuffed hands, screaming back at the ungodly sound, fearfully challenging it. The inhuman cry built to an ear-shattering screech, and Felix felt his ears pop. Felix opened his eyes and was met by the blinding light from the sun. Everything was white and then started to come back into focus. He was sitting on his porch, propped up against the siding of the house. He was still covered in blood, and Dr. Hummel was still sprawled out, face first, on the porch in front of him. The gushing blood from his back had stopped, but his body, as well as the wooden planks below it, were saturated in the dark, sticky red liquid. Flies buzzed around the body, and the stench of death infiltrated all of Felix's senses. He was sure the smell alone was what woke him from his nightmare. Or his vision. He wasn't sure what he'd just experienced. It felt so real. The walking through town, the interrogation. Even Detective Barnes. Reality was starting to become hard to distinguish from the surreal events plaguing Burroughs. He felt tired, sluggish, listless. The events occurring were so confusing that he didn't even care to think too deeply about them. His mind wished it all away, and half pretended nothing was happening. Out of the corner of his eye, a sparkling glimmer on the porch turned his head. It was a tiny shard of glass he had failed to clean up. The milk bottles. Stitched Mason. He needed to get to the Mason's dairy farm. He needed to know about the milk bottles. He needed to know who was placing them at random doorsteps around Burroughs. And more importantly, why. The Mason dairy farm was a 5-minute walk from his home. After Felix covered Dr. Hummel's body with a blanket from his living room couch, he hopped in his car. Once he got the engine running, the lights on the dash flickered. Then the engine light, the hazards, the oil, the gas. And finally they all stopped. The dash went black, and the car died. Felix tried to turn the key again, but the darn thing wouldn't even turn over. Frustratingly, he removed the keys and slammed them into the passenger's door. It was all starting to weigh on him. The deaths, the mysterious happenings. He needed answers. What should have been a 5-minute drive turned into a 15-minute walk to the dairy farm. After clearing the bend, he saw a broken mailbox with a missing flag. A tall, flimsy sign sat behind it with a picture of a cow. The cow painting was old and had started to chip away. Mason's dairy farm was the only one of its kind within 50 miles. Stitched Mason inherited the job from his father, who inherited it from his father. It was a true family business. Stitch had 2 boys. Harrison and Gage were both in their early teens and were in line to take over the business after Stitch would pass away. The history of the farm always drew attention from around the state. They'd had a steady line of cows over the years that never failed to produce anything less than quality milk. So much so that in recent years, Stitched Mason had opened up an online store where people from neighboring states could order and have it shipped directly to them from the farm. Felix walked up the driveway in fresh clothes. He knew he'd create a panic if he arrived in the clothes soaked by Hummel's blood. That's what happened in the nightmare. Felix walked up the steps, and the first thing he noticed was the hanging potted plants that surrounded the house. It was common knowledge that Stitch Mason had quite the green thumb, were all dead, dried and shriveled. What were once beautiful colorful treats for the eyes were now expired, brown and rotten. The drought could have explained the plants, but so could neglected care. Felix also noticed a hose unspooled in the yard and partially embedded in the dried grass. Like it had been there for a while. Felix knocked on the door and it flung open immediately. The two teenage boys stood there, just inside the darkened home, both holding shotguns with their sights set on him. Felix threw his arms up and gasped. "Don't shoot. Please." "Who are you?" one of them asked. "Felix Ryder. My parents own the farm just up the road." Ryder. The boys seemed to recognize the name and relaxed their weapons to their sides. "What do you want? Is your father home? I need to speak with him." "No," one of the boys said. Both of them appeared worried, and Felix was quick to notice. They acted as if they had something to hide. "Where is he?" Neither boy answered. Felix then looked closely at both of the boys' skin. It was pale and dry. It peeled in certain areas like after a bad sunburn. "Where's your father, boys? Where's Stitch?" They two boys hesitated, but the eldest, Harrison, finally spoke up, although softly. "He went out last night to search the farm. He hasn't come back yet." "Search the farm? What for?" "Something was out there." "What was it?" "Don't know." It didn't make any sense. "Something. It was creeping around by the cow barn. It was walking slowly, too." Gage added. "A person?" Harrison shook his head and Gage was visibly uncomfortable. "It was moaning, or howling, or something," Harrison said. It wasn't right. Dad went out to look for it. He wanted to scare it away. Felix turned around and looked out amongst the vast pastures, crops and barns the Masons' property was made up of. There were so many places Stitch could have gone. "Stay here," Felix said. "Keep the door locked. I'll go look for him." He took the four-wheeler. "There's another one in that barn," Harrison said, pointing to an old barn next to the garage. "Thanks," Felix said. The boys closed the door, and Felix waited to hear the lock before he hopped down from the porch and jogged over to the barn. He pushed the barn door open, and was met with dust falling from the rafters. A musty smell overwhelmed him. Not disgusting, just old. Like a wet cardboard box. He walked through the hay that coated the ground, and over to one of the two four-wheelers left. There was an empty spot in between them from where Stitch Mason had taken one. The keys to both of them were already in the ignitions. He hopped on one, and turned the key. Nothing. He tried again with the same results. The vehicle wasn't even trying to start. He climbed off and hopped on the other one. Nothing. Felix thought about his car not starting, and now these. What are the chances? He thought. He looked around the barn, and saw dozens of milk crates stacked upon one another along the far wall. He walked over to them and saw they were filled with empty milk bottles. The bottles in the crates were clear, but had a noticeable blue tint in the glass. The bottoms of them had a carefully engraved Mason Dairy Farm logo. "They're not the same," Felix quietly said to himself, comparing them to the milk bottles appearing around town. These were newer. Sleek. They weren't dirty with old corroded milk stains in the grooves. There was no sour odor. Those bottles didn't come from this farm. Felix left the barn and started across the property on foot. He passed the many cow barns, hearing the animals mooing inside, and walked along a somewhat smaller cornfield. Around the other side of the cornfield was another barn. He approached the barn and noticed it was in bad shape. The paint was actively peeling off of the outer walls, and the entire thing seemed to creak and crack in the breeze. There was a dark green moss growing near the base of the barn and seemed to be on every side of it. Felix circled the barn and then called out, "Hello," as he came to an opening on the back side. It wasn't a door, but a hole in the wall. The interior was dark, and he couldn't really make out anything inside. A noise from inside did pique his curiosity. It was a shuffling sound. Something was inside the barn, moving about. It was reminiscent of the noise in the basement. It crunched on the ground and sounded clumsy, just like the basement creeper. "Stitch," Felix called out again. He was met by a blast of the all-too-familiar foul odor that he'd come to despise. It blew out from the opening on the barn wall and created a feeling of nervousness in Felix. His heartbeat picked up and anxiety took over, bringing him to his knees. Shivers took over his body and he felt afraid. He didn't want to see what was stomping around inside the barn. He didn't want to know what it was anymore. The wool started low this time and grew louder and louder until Felix's ears were ringing. He became dizzy and grabbed his head, screaming in pain. "Stop it," Felix screamed. "Stop it." The wool came to an abrupt stop, right on command, and everything went dead silent. Felix stopped screaming and slowly looked up. A small puff of dust spun out from the hole in the wall, and two wide eyes vacant of their pupils illuminated in the darkness. "Tell it," the unseen entity growled. Felix jumped to his feet and ran as the wool once again erupted like an explosion behind him, more aggressive and commanding than he had yet heard it. Felix didn't look back. The thought of what he would see scared him deeply. He just ran until the barn would no longer be in sight. Felix stopped to catch his breath near a lone cow barn. This one was not grouped with the others close to the house. It looked like it hadn't been used in quite some time. There was an old wire fence, twisted and rusty, that encased the barn. Some of it had been flattened to the ground, and that's where Felix made his way in. He walked over the fence and up to the side of the dilapidated structure, where a haphazardly built bench sprouted off from the wall. He carefully sat down on the bench and heard it crack almost immediately. As soon as he stood to his feet, the bench broke off of its rusty hinges and crumbled to the ground. Felix looked around and wasn't exactly sure where on the farm he was. He saw fields in every direction. A cold breeze then took him by surprise, and he fully expected what came next. A foul odor, just like clockwork, feelings of dread and nervousness. Dizziness also tormented his brain. He knelt to the ground to try and fight the nausea that twisted his stomach. The wool was next. It traveled with the breeze, canvassing the land looking for him. Felix knew it now. He was what this thing was after. He just didn't know why. A sudden crash in the barn behind him startled Felix back to his feet. He spun around and stared at the barn as the wind blew up against his back and engulfed him. It was coming from every direction now, panning from one ear to the other. Above and below. All of the sounds then met in one place. The barn he stood before. Another crash made him jump. Something was in there. Something was luring him in. And as scared as he was, Felix just had to know what it was, what it looked like, and what it wanted. He put his fear aside and chose to confront the unknown. Silence took over again, leaving the creaking barn door as the center of everything. Felix pushed the door open and looked inside. He was cautious and didn't want to just waltz into certain death. He needed to do it carefully. He was dealing with the unknown, after all. He peeked his head in, and the odor was overwhelming. Sour milk, mixed with something else. That something else was familiar, yet hard to put a finger on. The buzzing of a swarm of flies slowly faded in, and he noticed them around something in the center of the barn. Felix crept through the door and took slow, carefully placed steps, until the barn door was out of reach. He pushed forward and covered his mouth and nose with the collar of his shirt. The stench was rotten, and then he was finally able to identify it. It was death. The sunlight from outside acted as a spotlight, coming through a splintered hole in the roof, bringing the focus solely on the 3 dead cows in the center of the barn. They had been ripped open, had their eyes removed, and were soaking like sponges in their own blood. Felix stumbled backwards and tripped over an old metal pail. He fell onto his back and sloshed around on the blood-soaked floor. The ground was wet, the air was rotten and cold, and his vision darkened. The Wu was inside the barn with him. It rushed over top of him, but he still couldn't see it. He could feel it touch him as it seemed to just float back and forth, releasing its horrible howl. "Stop it. Please." Felix screamed as he closed his eyes. His screaming only enraged the Wu, and it swelled louder. Thunder cracked outside, and the barn shook violently. Felix scurried to his feet and ran out of the old shelter. He stopped only a couple yards out of the barn. He had hit a cold spot on the property, and it chilled his bones. He stared straight ahead, witnessing the surreal image of his father, once again, standing before him. Francis Ryder was pale. His clothes were dirty, and he held a shovel in his hand. The spade of the shovel dipping into the soil beneath him. Francis spoke without moving a muscle on his face. "Don't tell it, Felix." His father's voice spoke from somewhere else. Felix didn't respond. He refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. Francis lifted the shovel and stabbed it back into the earth angrily. "Don't tell it." Felix shook his head. Tears ran down his cheeks. "I won't," he assured his father, even though he didn't understand his mysterious concerns. In the blink of an eye, his father was gone, and Felix found himself looking at an old four-wheeler. The grass beneath it was dried and dead, maybe even burned, and weeds had grown up from underneath of it and wrapped around the wheels and sides of the idle vehicle. The man was slumped over in the driver's seat, and Felix immediately recognized the man by his stature and splotchy facial hair. It was Stitch Mason. Felix rushed up to the vehicle and shook the farmer. "Mr. Mason." Stitch slumped forward, and Felix saw his back had been torn open. His ribs had been forced backwards through his body and protruded out and around his spine. The blood and flesh hanging from the exposed bones was dry and crawling with maggots. Felix backed away in shock. "This can't be real," he thought. There was no possible way for the scene to look like this if Stitch Mason had only gone out last night. The four-wheeler looked aged and weathered, and Stitch appeared long dead. Felix had quickly made his way back to the farmhouse. The front door was wide open when he got back, but he stopped before he entered. He turned around and looked out across the land. Fear began to sink its menacing teeth back into his skin, and he grew anxious. The pit of his stomach started to twist around as the occurring events began to feel like a sickening new reality. The faint sound of thunder accompanied the dark sky crawling over the horizon. It was coming back, and this time, Felix didn't have the energy to hide from it. Part of him just wanted to close his eyes and forget it all. Maybe it'll just all go away. But the other part of him needed to know what was happening in Burroughs, and to the people he knew and cared about. Felix walked into the Mason house, and was disturbed by the silence. Where Harrison and Gage once were on guard with shotguns, there was now no one. No protection, no urgency to fend off the uncertain intruder. No longer did there appear to be concern for the darkness outside to invade the home through the forbidding open front door. Harrison. Gage. Felix called out as the house dimmed into a sea of shadows. Through the living room window, he watched the clouds rush through the sky like the surf of a beach. It was moving quicker than it ever had before. Something was happening. Harrison. Felix called out again, moving through the home room by room. He entered the kitchen and finally found the boys. They were sitting on the floor, propped up against the cabinets, and in some obvious distress. Or, at least Gage was. Harrison was a different story. He didn't seem to be okay at all. His eyes were closed, he sat completely motionless, and dried blood was crusted to the sides of his face, having come from inside his ears. Felix rushed to them and knelt down. What happened? Gage looked up to Felix slowly. He was as white as a ghost, and his lips were raw. His eyes drooped, and his whole body trembled. I don't know. Gage was barely able to mutter. Felix felt for a pulse in Harrison's neck, but couldn't find one. He then noticed an odd odor. First he had subconsciously connected it to Harrison, but now he wasn't so sure. It was a damp odor, similar to mud. It was strong inside the home. Did you find our dad? Gage struggled to ask. Felix looked back down at Gage and nodded. Gage closed his eyes and leaned his head back on the cabinet. He knew his dad was dead. What's happening? I don't know. The entire house slipped into darkness. The daunting clouds in the sky blanketed Burroughs once again, sealing in an imminent and unimaginable horror. Thunder began to rumble from above and lightly rattled the glass inside the house. I have no idea what's happening, Felix repeated. He looked back at Gage and saw he was starting to slip away. He grabbed Gage by the shoulders and gently rocked him. Wake up, Gage. Gage opened his eyes and looked into Felix's. He was scared and also seemed to be fatally succumbing to whatever had damaged him. He didn't have any kind of fight left in him. What happened to you? Felix asked. Gage struggled to swallow and then opened his mouth to speak. It came back. What was it? Gage closed his eyes and bloody tears dripped from them. I don't know. But it didn't go far. It's searching. Searching for what? Gage opened his eyes with a new look of confusion. I don't know. Felix thought back to the whole reason he came to the farm to begin with. The milk bottles. Do you know anything about old milk bottles? Gage squinted. What? Someone has been leaving old milk bottles around Burroughs. On front porches. People have stepped on them and then died. People are dying everywhere. Gage shook his head slowly. I don't know. Kind of sounds like that old milk boy legend. What milk boy legend? Gage's body began to go limp, and Felix was quick to help him sit up straight again. What legend, Gage? It was just something Dad used to threaten us with. Do your chores, or the milk boy will take you. Who's the milk boy? Gage looked at Felix differently. He didn't understand the sudden interest in such an old story that he never believed to be anything other than a bogeyman tale. Gage. Who is the milk boy? I don't really remember the whole story. Dad hasn't mentioned it since we were little. Felix grew frustrated. He knelt in closer and plastered his face with a dead serious look. Remember. Felix ordered. Gage desperately searched the back of his mind, but it was all too fuzzy. I don't. There was a b-boy who claimed to have found 5 souls of the damned. He captured them somehow. Locked them up. I can't remember. What else? There has to be more than that. Felix's persistence started to bother Gage. His mind began to race. Why was this so important? Gage thought back real hard to when he was young and stubborn to not do his chores around the farm. He thought back to the old story his dad, Stitched Mason, used to scare them with, in the hopes that they would just be responsible and do them. The damned were stolen from the boy. It drove him mad. Gage continued. He was determined to get them back. He was a milk boy in his town. So one morning, each house he delivered the milk to, he'd go inside. If he didn't find the souls, he killed the people who all lived there. He did this until the entire town was dead. Felix was focused. Where were the souls? He never found them. Felix backed away from Gage. Thunder began to roar outside again, and the wind shook the house like a passing freight train. The house was dark, and violent lightning began to blast through the sky, flickering its blue hue throughout the kitchen. This was new. Felix looked to the light fixture swinging frantically from the ceiling, and then thought of his car, and the four-wheeler Stitched Mason was on. He then looked at his watch, and it was frozen at 12:01. The bodies around town, the stale stench of decay, the overgrowth of weeds around Stitch's four-wheeler and the front porch. Burroughs was dying. A strong wind blew across the dairy farm and pounded against the house. The windows in the kitchen rattled until they popped. Glass exploded into the room and showered the floor. Felix covered his head and stood to his feet. He looked out the broken window and watched as the wind began its catastrophic damage to the farm. Lightning slithered through the black clouds like nightmarish worms and burrowed back into their darkness. With one deafening crack of thunder, Felix dropped to the ground. He thought his heart was going to burst from his chest. He looked over at Gage, who now rested his head upon his brother's shoulder. The entire Mason family was gone. The howling wind outside seamlessly transformed into the dreaded whool, tickling Felix's nerves. Anxiety attacked his body, and he raced for the front door, blowing out onto the porch and into the front yard. He looked around as the ear-splitting whool was more prominent than ever. It overpowered the thunder and seemed to be coming from all directions. As the twisted, pulsating lightning flared up in the sky again, Felix caught a glimpse of something perched upon the roof of the Masons' farmhouse. It was a tall, ghostly figure, constructed of shadows and terror. It stood in a most awkward manner, extending its arms out to its sides, further and longer than humanly possibly. It grew taller and wailed terribly under the strobing light spectacle above. It was responsible for the whool that injected dread and fear into anyone who would hear it. The lightning abruptly dispersed, and the farm fell into darkness once again. Felix could no longer see the figure which roosted upon the house. He panicked and ran as fast as he could away from the farm, leaving the frenzied howls and disembodied screams behind him. Felix had lost track of time, but it felt like it had taken forever to get back to his family's farm. Just as he hit the property line, a blinding flash of lightning and a booming crack of thunder dropped buckets of rain on Burroughs. Felix was soaked to the bone before he even hit the front porch. He ran and jumped up the steps, slipping on their slick surface. He fell hard, landing on his stomach, right beside the rotting corpse of Dr. Hummel. They were face to face. Hummel's eyes were open wide, his mouth agape. Out of his back, his ribsage had been pushed, becasing his spine like it was trapped in a birdcage. The front of his body had fused with the porch, creating an unnerving and gorily surreal image. Dr. Hummel looked like a piece of sloppy artwork from a deranged and vile mind. Felix stumbled to his feet, realizing he'd twisted his ankle when he had slipped. He limped to the front door and tried to turn the knob. It fell off and crumbled on the porch. Confused, he banged on the door, only to have the wood weaken and chip away under his clenched fists. He backed away from the door as the rain pounded the ground harder and harder, and the wool returned to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. He frantically looked around, dreading seeing the ghostly figure again. Desperate for salvation, he settled on the barn that sat yards away from the house. He hobbled down the porch steps again, and limped as quickly as he could through the now oversaturated yard. Large puddles were forming all around him, and the lightning that tore apart the sky burned his eyes, and severed every nerve in his body. Felix threw open the barn doors, and the wild lightning crashed behind him, sprawling out a flickering shadow of himself across the dirt and scattered hay inside. He rushed in, leaving the loudness of the rain behind him. It was now of a more muffled volume, but he could hear it hitting the rooftop like a barrage of bullets. He closed the doors and felt a gust of cold brush up against him. He spun around to see, yet again, another blip of his father's image. He stood in the center of the barn, holding a shovel, and then echoed his "don't tell it" phrase once again, in a raspy and demented whisper. Francis disappeared just as quickly as Felix had laid eyes on him, leaving Felix confused and afraid. Two emotions he'd become all too familiar with. He didn't know what his father was referring to. Was it a warning? A cryptic message meant to help him? He looked down at the soft, disturbed soil beneath where the apparition of his father had just stood. The dirt had been dug up and piled back on. His father wielded a shovel in every brief appearance since his death. Before his death, Francis did have a shovel in the barn. This barn. Felix had come out just days earlier to check on his father. Francis was sitting on a bale of hay. He couldn't recall why he was in there. The shovel was dirty. The sour stench blew through moments later. It stunk of death. Felix hurriedly limped to the small patch of bothered dirt. He kicked it around, and then dropped to his knees. The thunder exploded outside once again as he furiously began to dig out the dirt with his bare hands. He clawed and scooped, and tossed the excess dirt aside. Something hard and slick grazed his fingertips. Francis had buried something. Felix picked up his pace, thrashing his arms wildly, and sending dirt flying every which way. The sickening aroma creeped back into the barn, along with a hazy mist that twirled about with a haunting elegance. A low, humming noise from behind Felix quickly accelerated into the dreaded whool, and now surrounded him. It grew louder and louder as Felix dug faster and faster. It became a nightmarish howl in his ears, like thousands of damned souls screaming and screeching in pain all at once. It was resounding. Felix bit his lip until it bled, and screamed back. He spun around and saw the ghostly figure again, cloaked by crawling shadows and filled with a bloody core. Felix closed his eyes, beckoning it to just go away. But it was too late. Felix felt the breath completely vacate his body, leaving it hollow and dry. He opened his eyes and stared at the whool, looking into its pale, decrepit, featureless eyes. It screamed at him, forcing Felix's eyes closed again. He saw the flashes of lightning striking through the insides of his eyelids, and the whool surged until it finally shattered. Everything went silent, and Felix felt and heard his stomach rip open. A forceful gust cracked his ribcage, pushing it back and tearing out the other side of his body. 20 hours later. Just outside of Burroughs. A slick chrome Camaro sped through the picturesque countryside of rural Wisconsin. Heavy rock music blared from the open windows. Behind the wheel was 30-year-old Eric Humphrey. One hand on the wheel, the other was swiping through the playlist on his phone. He smirked as he found the next song he wanted to radiate through the countryside. As Eric tapped the play button, an incoming call displayed the image of a woman suggestively posing in a nightgown. He answered the call, and the music paused. "Hey Casey." "Hey, babe. Just checking in." His girlfriend's voice came through the car speakers. "Stopped for a burger about 30 minutes ago. I'm about to cross into Burroughs here now. Did you get a hold of Felix yet?" "No, it's weird. I can't get anyone. His phone must be dead. His parents' landline must be disconnected, or something." Casey laughed on the other line. "Sounds like that town is disconnected." Eric nodded with a smile. "Flex always tells me how Mayberry the place is. But, he's been my friend since we were kids. He needs me. A nice little surprise drop-in should spruce up his attitude." "I hope so. Make sure you tell him about my dad's offer." "Will do. I can't see him saying no to the job. It's almost double what he was making at Tech Corporation." "Well, I hope he takes it. Thank, babe. I'll call you tonight when I'm settled in." "Perfect," Casey said. "Love you. Love you." Eric ended the call, and the next song rattled the car. He bit his lip and banged his head along with the crashing drums that started the song. Eric sped past a sign that said "Welcome to Burroughs, Wisconsin, America's small town," and left it to drift away in his rear-view mirror. As the wind from the speeding car died down, the "Welcome to Burroughs" sign began to chip and crack along its edges, and eventually crumbled to dust, falling to the rocky roadside beneath it. Eyewitness report transcript. Burroughs, Wisconsin discovery site. Witness: Eric J. Humphrey. "I'd spoken with my best friend, Felix Ryder, only a day or so earlier. We called him Flex back home in Green Bay. He was from Burroughs. He came back here after losing his job. He wasn't too happy about that. What 30-year-old wants to move back with their parents after living so successfully in their late 20s? The last time I'd talked to him, he was telling me about how his parents weren't doing so good. I think he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to leave them like they were. Older and helpless. I asked if he'd be back for the first Packers game, which would have been a week ago now, and he said he didn't think he would. So, as any good friend would do, I was able to get my girlfriend's dad to offer him a job. I drove out to Burroughs to surprise him with a guaranteed job that he would have loved. I crossed the border into Burroughs, and everything immediately felt wrong. There was no one around. I mean, no one. It was the quietest place I'd ever stepped foot in. Cars were parked in odd places, like they had just stopped working and were abandoned. The grass and weeds around town were overgrown, and there was a wet moss that seemed to be growing all over the buildings and homes. The farms all seemed dead. No animals, no people. It smelled like old wet grass. The sun had baked everything, which only intensified the odor. I was concerned for Felix and his parents. I drove straight to the Ryder's farmhouse, and couldn't believe my eyes. I still shudder thinking about it. The dead man on the porch. He was fused to it. His rib cage had exploded out of his back. There was dried blood all over him and the porch. The front door had rotted out and was infested with bugs. I looked inside the home from the doorway, and a god-awful smell hit me. I gagged and ran away from the porch. I just stared at the house, breathing heavily, and listening to the silence all around me. I looked over to the barn. The doors were open, so I rushed over to it, calling for Flex and his parents. I ran in, and that's when I saw him. He was on the ground, just like the man on the porch. His ribs had been pushed through his back. He was covered in blood, but it was dry too, like he'd been there for weeks. I heard a loud buzzing noise, and it took me a minute or two to realize the entire barn was infested with flies. They were mostly focused on Felix's body, but were definitely everywhere. I ran back to my car and called 911. They had to dispatch units from Desmond, the next town over. I gave a statement to the police right away, but they said I was unfit to give it at that time. I guess I was a little more than hysterical. It wasn't until I got back home to Green Bay that I started seeing stories about Burroughs on the news. The story went national, and then worldwide within hours. Everyone's obsessed with what happened there, but no one has any idea what they're obsessed with. Burroughs practically went extinct, and very violently at that. I read online that everyone's cell phones were completely dead. The cars were dead. Clocks and watches too. Not one citizen of Burroughs was alive. And unless they can start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, whatever happened there may never be solved. I can already see this in the history books, decades from now, as one of the great unexplained mysteries of the world. But there has to be an explanation. Everything has an explanation. Things like this just don't happen without reason, whether malicious or natural. I will probably never get the answers to the thousands of questions furiously racing around in my head, bumping into one another, with nowhere to go. They'll be trapped without release, and that sits very uncomfortably with me. I'll miss my friend until the day I die. Maybe only then will I know what happened. Maybe in the next life, or whatever comes after this, he can tell me what was happening in Burroughs, what he saw, and what could have possibly done that to him. It's an image I can't shake, and I see it every time I close my eyes. His bloodshot eyes wide open, his ribs standing upright like fence posts from his body. The stiffness in which he clenched his fists in his last moments. The excavation team and officials that were called in tried to fairly distribute the possessions of the Burroughs residents to anyone close to them. I was the closest living person to Felix and his family, so they were nice enough to send me boxes of their things. Most of the items seemed random, but at least they tried to show sympathy. It's the least they could do, I guess, after quarantining the town and kicking us out. They found an old photo album Felix's parents had under their bed. It contained pictures of me and him from our high school days. They found an old scrapbook that Felix had made in school, as well as his wrestling trophies and sports card collection. They even sent me some sort of softball-sized marble that they said he might have tried to bury in his last moments. They thought it might have been special to him, therefore it would be special to me. I didn't even know what it was. There are things inside of it that rattle whenever you shake it. Casey says they're probably dead bugs or something inside, because ever since that thing came into our home here in Green Bay, there's been a really foul odor that pops up once in a while. It smells sour, almost sulfuric. It smells just like that barn did on the Ryder's farm. But if it was important to Felix, it's important to me. I think I'll hang on to it. I can always hide it away in a box, or even bury it in the yard if the odor got too bad. But hell, it's just an odor. It's not like it's hurting anyone.